Star Wars: Force Shadow. The prequel story to the fan film Descendants of Order 66. A novel written by Faison Shark, a Bantapudu production. Translated and read by Oliver Rahn. Part 2. Breathing in the Dark. Tatooine. Outside, the binary suns were shining above the plains of the northern Dune Sea and cast long shadows from the Big Mesra Plateau. But in the chambers of the Desert Palace, located on the edge of the plateau for almost 700 years, the cycles of the two suns were as insignificant as the life of a Twi'lek dancer. In here, or down here as Bib Fortuna used to say, Jabba the Hutt was the law. Down here, Tatooine's biggest crime lord decided over day and night. And right now, it was a dead black night. Jabba had the audience chamber and the adjoining floors be cleared. All his servants and slaves had been sent away. Darkness had taken over their places. Deepest shadows nestled behind the rattled curtains and down in the Rancor Pit. A semi-darkness covered the walls and its ornaments and left barely more but a dirty grey. The wrinkles beneath Jabba's mouth looked like grooves in the twilight, like forced incisions, witnesses of the attempt to separate Jabba's head from his neck after all. The worm's giant yellow eyes were shimmering, and it wasn't his lethargy why they had been focusing on the center of the audience chamber for several minutes. Jabba had a visitor. A holographic visitor.
Tell him I understand his concern,
said Jabba, and let the old protocol droid that found his last assignment here and now translate.
But secrets are in safe hands with me.
The stranger answered something in an alien language. It seemed to be basic, but wasn't accent-free. He explained there's nothing to worry about. The droid translated the hologram's words. He said he has found a way to keep the secret.
Of course he has.
Jabba grumbled, and the protocol droid was smart enough to not translate this remark.
Tell him to explain what he wants.
The holographic stranger responded something, but the droid hesitated with the translation. Useless junk, Jabba remembered. The wiping of its long-term memory hadn't been a great help for the droid's performance either. Did it know it was speaking its last lines? Almighty Jabba, the droid stuttered. He is asking if you can breathe in the dark. 10 years before YAVIN. The long night had fallen over the galactic civilization. It has been 9 years since the Republic and the Jedi had found their end in the flames of betrayal. Now the Empire had control over most parts of the known galaxy. The dark Sith-Lord Darth Vader had been entrusted with a hunt for the last remaining Jedi. Relentless, he and the legions of stormtroopers chased them down, pulling a trace of blood behind them through the blackness of space. In these most desperate times, the dispersed survivors of the Jedi Order are groping their way through the darkness. Some of them have long lost the path and are falling towards the void. Asteroid Field. Distant stars were reflecting as faint dots of light on the burnt and dirty hull of the giant battleship. The countless durasteel plates that were coating the bow were deformed and had taken on a light grey color, as if a giant hand had dipped the ship into a Xeno nebula. In fact, the disfigurement of the forward hull had been caused by great heat, as it appears when an object rapidly enters the atmosphere of a Class M planet. Once the ship had been equipped with countless weapons, including 14 quad turbo laser towers, 34 twin laser cannons, and 2 forward ion cannons in the bow, of which only burnt remains were left. The worn bottom side had in old times been fitted with more than 100 torpedo tubes. But meanwhile, this part of the battleship was so badly damaged that firing the few remaining torpedoes would have been the end of the shipwreck. While the burned-out Colossus shifted through space, a mere endless asteroid field approached, slowly but steadily. First, tiny stones hit the hull, unbraked in space. In the caves of middle-sized asteroids, countless swarms of Minox, in space-living creatures, awoke. As the radiation of the defective engines had woken those instincts the Minox had acquired over the millennia. A dark grey rock fragment collided with the flank of the battleship. It hadn't moved very fast, but the ship was too slow to avoid it. From the bridge, Nilas could see how the newly emerged leak let precious oxygen into the vacuum of space. Nilas followed the escape of the essential mist and forced himself to not feel and fear. "Go on, keep flying," he murmured, only to recognize in the next moment that he was talking to the ship again. He screwed his face. This thing is even more lifeless than on its maiden voyage. The only thing alive around here is me. Nilas was sitting on the discolored floor of the bridge, pieces of broken console stations and screens pointing towards the ceiling above him. Here in the front half of the commando center, not too much of his sight was blocked, and so he could follow the path of the next asteroid, this time a smaller one, that was hitting against the front hull. The impact shock did not reach the bridge. Nilas grinned. The plates were probably too loose already. He bent forward into a hunched position. His eyes focusing on a bigger asteroid, he continued searching for a way to forget what was lying 3 meters behind him. The dead body of his best friend. Brawl. Roaring masses of blood were cutting its way through the long unused veins of his emaciated body. The parts it reached started to feel terribly hot, almost as if they could not hold the strange tonic and would burst. His head started to hurt when it had to deal with the same problem. His stomach cramped as the organs started to reassume their full functions. With a seemingly relentless will, his heart thrashed itself to not fall asleep again. And eventually, he had waded through an ocean of pain. Behind him was the way out of apparent death. Ahead of him was a life of suffering. The agonies were not gone, but they had weakened so far that in some moments he could think clearly. He tensed up his muscles, pushed himself off the rock behind his back, and floated through the airless, gravity-free space of the cave. He reached another wall and held onto it with his sucker-like right hand. His eyes got much better now. The smeary film that protected the retina against the particles of space had been sufficiently produced by his glands. He puffed out a cloud of red mist through his nostrils. Red meant danger. Something or someone had awakened him. The whole cave around him was lit up in red now. There was red mist coming from his brother's noses too. And suddenly, he started to move. And the others moved with him. Asteroid field. Life. Something had come to life. Nilas lifted his chin a bit and directed the view of his tired eyes to the asteroid field ahead of him. He felt something in the force, something out there. It seemed like bubbles of chaos were approaching through an ocean of tranquility. He didn't know what they were, but those bubbles moved directly towards him. He stared at the small object that was lying in front of him on the floor of the bridge. The look made him feel insecure, gave him niggling doubts. "What are you doing?" he rounded. He looked up again, and now he saw them in the middle of the asteroids. Creatures, scrawny and slim. Torsos of pale hairless skin. Minox, he thought. But the closer they came, and the stronger he could feel the chaos bubbles, the more he knew what was approaching there was something completely different. He wished the ship was fully operational. Wished it was under his control. Then he could have activated the guns or maybe the defensive lasers. After all, the creatures were very close already. But that opportunity was not given. Not for a price Nilas was ready to pay. He got up, for the first time in hours. His skin stuck to the inside of his sweaty clothing. He hated that feeling. The chaos bubbles had almost reached the bridge. Nilas fixated one of the creatures with his eyes. At the same time, he called the Force to be prepared for everything, to be able to react when they attached themselves to the panorama windows, when they started to rip instruments out of the outer hall, when they broke through. Nilas winced. Time froze. A stitch hit him right in the heart. His lips suddenly stood open, formed to a sign of silent realization. Then he screamed. He stabilized himself with the help of the Force when he spun around and stormed towards the bridge door, just away from the window. Everything was accompanied by a horrible clinking sound that continued even when Nilas already felt the suction on his neck, stronger and stronger, adamant. Death was calling. Nilas could not reach the door anymore. He threw himself forward, got hold of the handle of the shaft cover. In the same moment, the suction pulled his feet from underneath him. Death was calling louder. Something grabbed Nilas' right foot. Something that was even colder than the rapidly falling temperature on the bridge. A screeching awoke. Then another one further away. Nilas felt he was surrounded by chaos. Knew he was going to die if not. He looked ahead. Directly to the one hand that held onto the handle. The one hand that was holding onto his life. The other one was holding death. The snow-white relic that had been lying on the bridge for all this time, the ghost mask whose touch he had learned to bear in many painful hours. He was holding it in the other hand, touching the blood-red inside with his fingertips, touching the real inside with his thoughts. Since he had picked it up, hastily, almost by instinct, he had resisted. But now he retreated. He invoked death to not lose his life. And death accepted. It said,
"Now, breathe the darkness."
Nilas got engulfed, lost himself, barely recognized that the suction ebbed away, and the air calmed down. But while his own thoughts were losing themselves in the night, his perception widened. The world that appeared in the Force got freed from the mist, became clear. He could see far, he could do anything. The white mask stuck to the skin of his forearm. But what had been in it now filled the whole galaxy. He let go of the handle. The suction was gone, the endless vacuum of space was still dragging on the valuable air of the bridge deck of the ship. But Nilas had ordered the air to stay where it was. He withheld the greedy emptiness its food. And this irony almost took his breath away again.
"Now bring suffering to your enemies,"
Death said. 10 meters away from Nilas, where once was a panorama window, the chaos creatures returned. When they entered the gravity and atmosphere of the ship from open space, they looked almost like humanoid sea creatures stepping through an invisible aquarium wall. Their bony chests were moving heavily when they started breathing air for the first time. Some of them were spitting blood. They coughed it out of their big squeezered noses, and it was running down their bodies, dripping onto the floor of the bridge. "By Corellia's hells, who are you?" Nilas whispered, quietly and not expecting an answer. The creatures started to move. They were dragging themselves along the bridge directly towards Nilas. Most of them were limping, and some of them had already spat so much blood that they weakly sank to the floor. They did not bear the air. Nilas had no doubt about that. But behind the approaching lines, space seemed to spit out more and more creatures. Soon more than 30 had entered the ship. Nilas ordered them to die, and they obeyed. He reached out and Death lent him his eyes. Several hundred chaos creatures had approached the battleship, and in some places they had entered without any problems. They ripped out cables, used extruding body fluids to corrode cover panels, and destroyed consoles and displays. Nilas smiled, wary. The times when this ship was able to move by itself were long gone anyway. He listened with a shiver as Death whispered something to him. Good, Nilas rounded, knowing that Death did not care whether he was talking or just thinking. Death heard everything. Every small detail, even those thoughts that Nilas was not aware of himself. Nilas concentrated and then took control of the ship like he had done so many times on his journey whenever the course had to be corrected. Death showed him one of the bigger asteroids, a rock that looked like it had broken off a lifeless moon. Nilas felt that this asteroid consisted of rock with a high density. Its gravitation field must be enormous, he determined, higher than on some planets. With his thought, he directed the ship closer to the asteroid. He felt that strong forces started to work and tamper with the artificial gravity of the ship. With heavily pounding heartbeat, Nilas switched off the gravity generators and at the same time used the forces of death to protect himself from the effects of it. As all over the ship the chaos creatures got slower, some were forced to their knees, and they all walked along the walls as down was now where the asteroid was. Nilas' left hand clung to his dead friend's body. Then he slingshot the ship into hyperspace. The deadly, uncompensated acceleration squashed all chaos creatures to death. Coruscant. You are deep down. Beside you, dirty durasteel walls tower up on both sides. Their bottom must be somewhere below the bridge you are standing on. Their top end, you are not even sure they have one. You believe you know from the past what the top looks like, what it looks like in the sky, but that was a long time ago. You have forgotten, suppressed. The air is filled with pollutants. You feel them on your skin, in your lungs. It takes your strength and concentration to block them out. The poison, you realized that years ago, is seeping down from the sky as it is heavier than air. Down here, above a mystical ground, far below a mystical sky, it begins to accumulate, to compress to dense wafts. It is particularly bad down here, you hear someone say. You know that voice. You dimly remember that some time ago it had sounded different, full of hope, full of inner certainty, and trust into something that was bigger than reality. You get lost in thoughts. You push them away. You answer to that voice. You answer briefly, emotionless, barely listen to yourself. You realize suddenly, while you use all your power of your thought to push the poison molecules out of your lungs, the poison intrudes your thoughts, awakens memories, throws you back. Around you, the bridge of your old Corvette appears from the fog. Clones you killed back then have put their perforated armors back on and are pursuing the duties you have assigned to them. Times mix up. The crash has not happened yet, but the bridge is in flames already. Your bloodbath has not yet begun, but the clones are already groveling for mercy while still analyzing data and programming course vectors. Toxic gases in the air. You go and kill them all. They don't fight back. On the screen of the bridge, fire is blazing. Behind the flames, the ocean of skyscrapers approaches with a speed that almost drives you insane. It's getting loud and hot. Then comes the instinct. Then the pain. Then years follow.
Nilas!
You turn around. Sweitt Cheef is standing behind you on the bridge. He stands a bit higher than you, and his green-flaked skin shines from the particles in the air. You remember that the people of the Verk species are survival specialists. Their home planet Sembla a world in the Outer Rim, Sweitt had told you about it during a very dark night, features volcanic islands in vast oceans. The Verg have been nomads for millennia, and in addition are able to breathe underwater, as well as on land. But this is poison, and it is killing you both, and with it possibly the last of the Jedi.
We shouldn't go in this direction,
said Sweitt.
The air is getting worse. We don't know for how long this is gonna work. We could die.
You shake your head. In the distance you hear rushing noise of a dark ocean. You've been hearing it for months. You know you should be afraid, but you are not. You have never been as determined as in this moment. I'll move on, you say. For a moment you see an army of Jedi on both sides of the bridge. They gratefully nod at you, proudly. Some are looking up to you. Then they disappear, and all that is left is the poison. Sleheyron. During the night it sometimes was bearable. It was a bit colder then. The heat had not disappeared by midnight, but at least it didn't burn anymore. The planet had a strange atmosphere that could heat up very quickly, but emitted the added heat very quickly too. While during the day you had to deal with the much too close sun and several volcanoes and lava lakes, at night only the latter were left. For months Nokas Mepur had been moving only in the dark. It wasn't a total darkness. There was no such thing on a planet that seemed to consist only of different forms of fire. Even during nighttime there was an orange glow behind the Black Mountain ranges, and when one of the volcanoes erupted heavily, there were patterns of light on the dense layer of ash clouds. Nokas' facial expression darkened while he was walking towards the high outer wall. I shouldn't complain, he tried to persuade himself. I could have been stranded on a lifeless moon without atmosphere, or in open space. And after all, he smiled, but then dispelled his last thought. It's been 9 years now that the Jedi had been betrayed. Nokas had been on Kashyyyk at the time, home planet of the Wookiees and the exact opposite of Sleheyron. Kashyyyk had stayed neutral during the first 2 years of the war. The Wookiee Council, led by King Grok-Shawad, entered negotiations with the Republic as well as with the Confederation, but had hesitated with a decision. When the Confederation had lost patience, they sent droids to Kashyyyk, presumably to take King Grok-Shawad's son hostage. But in the process, Prince Rikumi had been killed. Nokas climbed up a stone hill, using the Force to carefully check which way would be the safest, so he wouldn't cause a landslide. Jumping from stone to stone, he approached the grey-brown outer wall that towered high over him. There were only a few places where he could get over it. This was the best possible one, and yet he would have to jump very high. When he had worked his way all the way to the wall, he sank into meditation to collect all his powers. His thoughts went back to Kashyyyk. After the death of the prince, the king had almost fallen into blind rage.
My decision? War against the invaders!
Kashyyyk had then joined the Republic, which sent many armed forces, even Jedi, even though their numbers had already decreased heavily. Nokas didn't remember anymore how many battles there had been in which he had fought side by side with the clone soldiers. A lot. Until that day the clones had betrayed him and the other Jedi. He still remembered what the death waves had felt like that had spread all over the galaxy. One of the clones, Tio Man, had turned on the other clones and had helped Nokas to escape and lived now as an unrecognized traitor among them. At least Nokas hoped that he was still alive. He didn't know anything about the galaxy. He didn't know if the Republic had won or what had happened to Kashyyyk. He only knew that the Jedi Order had been destroyed and that the number of survivors would be very small. He had stranded on Sleheyron during his hurried escape, and when he used the hyperspace ring whose programming had pointed there. There was not enough fuel for another jump. He couldn't send a radio signal if he didn't want the clones to find him. No one answered his calls in the Force. Nokas Mepur was cut off from everything. If the heat that he could barely push back with his Jedi techniques wasn't killing him, then he would just die of old age someday. But he would never be able to leave Sleheyron. He had collected enough of his energy. His body was now prepared to be accelerated with full power. He was now in better harmony with the Force than before. Even the heat had gone down, it seemed. Nokas took a last deep breath and then pushed himself off the ground. He heard small stones breaking away, felt how he rapidly broke through the air, saw the walls speed by him as a blurry something. Then the acceleration faded and Nokas changed the flow of the Force in his body. He pulled himself towards the wall and stuck to it with his hands and his feet, a technique he had learned from his master in the old days, long before the war. Silently, he got over the railing and landed on the wall walk, 30 meters above the ground. Below him, on the other side of the wall, Selene, the only city around, was sleeping. Even during the night, it could be seen that the city had been built in something like a half-crater. Centuries ago, the flank of the now extinct volcano must have broken off, and as the mountain still offered protection against the fire winds from the north, the Sleheyron had settled there. In the past, the area must have looked different. Ruins, barely more than foundations, of several skyscrapers could be found in the thousands in a circle of 1 or 2 kilometers. Once there must have been a giant city here that fell victim to nature's forces. There were caves under the surface where traces of the old Undercity could be seen. Everyone who didn't live in this city lived there. Nokas had chosen an underground ruin too. The standards of a Jedi weren't very high. Nokas walked a few meters along the wall walk, listened for disturbances in the Force. Ahead and behind him, each in some distance, there were 2 watchtowers embedded into the wall and occupied with a handful of Sleheyron. He hadn't tried to get into their minds, to blur his presence. They were so far away that Nokas could easily make a mistake and achieve the exact opposite. Luckily, the Sleheyron didn't know about the Jedi and would never have looked for this kind of intruder. When he reached the next steep metal staircase, Nokas began his descent. It was one of those buildings that leaned into the mountain. Nokas remembered that it had looked different a few years ago. Extensions had been made, new rooms had been built onto older structures, walls had been exchanged, energy lines had been installed. It was now 5 levels high that climbed along the mountain. Tracks carved into the mountain connected it to the neighboring buildings. As there was no level ground anywhere on Sleheyron, the Sleheyron had learned to adjust their buildings to the given conditions. At first, he slowly went towards the entrance of the 2nd level. If there was someone awake anywhere in the other buildings, he didn't want to arouse their suspicion. But then he felt the energies of 3 people in the Force, all coming from the house in front of him. One too many. Nokas accelerated his pace, opened the secured door with a slight move of his hand, and stepped into the hallway. It was colder here. The generators worked. He listened into the Force. 2 of the energies felt calm, maybe sleeping. But the 3rd one was awake. And it was direct. Nokas jumped ahead. Old battle reflexes came to life again. The Force took over his body and helped him perform a smooth landing move. At the same time, the ceiling collapsed. Had obviously been blown up, because now fragments cut the skin in his face and on his arms. A shower of metal particles hit his back. Then, the shadow jumped down to him, opening fire in mid-air. The helmet dampened the noise of the HD-7 engine a bit, but the voices of the other stormtroopers could barely be understood. Lieutenant Langkawi opened the panel of his arm armor and turned one of the switches a few degrees, surrounding down, radio up.
We have now entered the lower atmosphere.
The voice was that of the shuttle pilot.
Energy level down in the city is increasing.
Cowie didn't let the turmoil distract him, stared at the soldier facing him, highly focused. Nilla was written on the scratched chest armor. The soldier had served with Cowie for almost a year now, and had been among the first non-clones that had joined the stormtroops. Cowie himself had led a resistance group on Serenno during the Clone Wars, and when the Republic had started to support them in their battle, Cowie had been assigned a clone platoon. The unit that was sitting in the Sentinel shuttle with him now consisted completely of non-clones. Cowie had asked for that. A tremor went through the narrow, longest troop room of the ship. Each of the 54 soldiers was belted, and most of them had so little moving space that the belts would not have been necessary to keep them in their place.
Air defense fire.
The pilot reported again too hectically. There were more hits as the seconds passed by, but even though they didn't just seem to be graze shots, the shields apparently held. Cowie smiled under his helmet. He knew why the barrage hit, but didn't cause too much damage. It wasn't just any planet they were attacking. After all, Sleheyron was...
10 seconds to touchdown in city center.
Cowie nodded silently and cocked his E-11 gun. The Republic. They found me. This short thought alone went through his mind while his right hand shot up and unleashed a blast wave of the Force. The attacker was pulled into the air, crashed against the wall and ceiling above the entrance door, and had he not worn a helmet, he would at least have lost consciousness. In fact, he hadn't even lost his blaster, and let it howl up now. At this close range, Nokas could only barely and under great risk dodge the shots. After the first shots, he executed a long leap backwards, further into the house. He swung around the door frame and took cover behind the wall. Duraplast, he noted as he scanned the attacker's armor with the Force. Elite soldiers of the clone troops had worn armors made from that material. Was that an elite soldier standing in front of him? The thought patterns of his brain were unquestionably those of a battle-tried man. And the design of his armor? An object shot through the door, directly past the squatting Nokas, followed by a fire tail. Split seconds later it hit the wall and ripped it to shreds with a nasty bang. Nokas pulled his arms in front of his face and also used the Force to protect himself from fragments and debris. A rocket launcher, he thought, and bit on his dry lips. He forced himself to concentrate, listened with a speeding pulse for the click of the trigger. Sunken into the Force, squeezed against the wall. In the distance he heard rumble of the gun turrets. The thought came only dimly, but it was there. The Empire is here for me. They attacked Selene, and it is because of me. There was the click. Nokas squinted as a reflex, searched and found the rocket with the Force, scanned its structure, its setup, the strung together charges inside. A mere Sun 1126, no doubt. Special forces of the clones had used those back then and... Nokas snapped. The bomb burst about 1 meter before the door behind which Nokas was squatting. Still during the bang, he dived ahead, jumped directly into the heat of the expanding explosion of fire and smoke, used the Force to push the flames away from him. From the glaring center, wrapped into the fire haze, Nokas jumped directly towards the unprepared attacker. He dragged the man in the green armor to the ground, both hands pressed onto the chest armor. Then, an additional burst of the Force that threw the attacker onto the stone floor with deadly momentum. The man moaned. Still in touch with the Force, Nokas felt that the air started to escape the lungs, but that was all that happened. Half stunned, Nokas stared at the stranger's visor that now was less than 10 centimeters away from Nokas' face. This armor that...
You!
He said.
Jango Fett! But you are...
An electric charge, ignited 2 seconds ago, detonated. Nokas' world was consumed by pain. Tio Man stared up into the sky. It rained on Camino. Heavy drops pattered down from the faraway land of the blue-black clouds. He was standing outside on the landing platform. He was 6 years old. Today he dismantled his first practice droid. His clothing was soaked. The rain seemed to not be made of water, but deadly sparks. And exactly that was the case. The dark cloud cover was by no means above him. It was below him. 2 kilometers below the transparent steel glass of the cockpit window. He was not on Camino. He was on Sleheyron. His fighter was in a nosedive, and the rain was made of deadly lasers. He pulled the steering pad to the right, and his Y-wing obeyed immediately. With this, he got himself out of the gush again and forced the crew of the enemy cannons to recalculate their vectors. Tio Man didn't have to fear more but a lucky strike anyway. 12 years after their construction, the Y-wings were still among the most agile space fighters in the galaxy. No defense battery could precisely acquire them on such short distance, especially when they had been built by the people of this planet. The comlink in Tio Man's helmet creaked.
Squadron Leader Red, you're Squadron Leader Blue.
It sounded from the speaker.
We have escorted the shuttles to the city's landing points and switching off guns now.
Confirmed. Tio Man grimly nodded to himself. When the attack plan had been presented at the briefing, Tio Man had doubts about the feasibility. To switch off the guns after the troops had landed seemed pointless and risky to him. But now it was obvious that the military technology of Sleheyron was indeed as primitive as assumed in the attack plan. As a consequence, the enemy had not been able to intercept the shuttles, and now stormtroopers were walking through Selene before the residents could prepare themselves for a ground attack. The V-Wing squadron led by Tio Man entered the cloud cover. Tio Man reconfigured his target computer so that it assisted him during blind flight. He instructed his squadron to do the same. Some of the clones had only just been released from their training, and during the last weeks, Tio Man had to notice that they were lacking several essentials. Was it really possible that Camino's training program had impaired? He pushed the thought aside. It was bad enough that he had allowed himself to be homesick anyway. He didn't need this during battle. They broke through the cloud cover and Selene lay below them. Although the single houses had to be in a miserable condition, the city looked even more impressive than it did on the intelligence holograms. Embedded in the blown open slope of a volcano and surrounded by an enormous wall, Selene appeared like a huge castle, built to defend the savage forces of nature of this world. "Twin lasers in attacking position," he ordered via the squadron channel and took a deep breath. In addition to the lasers, every one of the 12 V-Wings had been fitted with a proton bomb. In the hands of a rookie, these bombs were a more than dangerous weapon to friend or foe. And what he himself could do with them, if he wanted to, scared him even more. Langkawi threw himself on the floor, not even trying to cushion the impact. Instead, he was holding on to his E-11 in order to immediately open fire. 2 men of the Sleheyron militia went down on the other end of the short road. He had hit one of them for sure. The other one could just as well have dodged. Quietly, he condemned the E-11 guns. In his youth in the Sereno resistance, he had had a lot more precise weapons. "Advance!" Kawi shouted and gave his unit a sign. They began to move, but even before they reached the next crossing, Kawi gave them the signal to stop. His soldiers followed when his view went up to the dead black cover of clouds. The second X-Wing squadron came roaring down from the sky, every fighter performing wild and lightning-fast maneuvers to avoid the fire of the defense battalions. "Get down!" A soldier suddenly shouted out, and Kawi and the others reacted within a heartbeat. The unit threw themselves onto the dusty ground of the road. Almost simultaneously, a loud bang burst through the air. The fighter squadron that had been over the city for several minutes had targeted one of the cannons. Coughing, Cowie lifted his head a bit and saw that in the northern part of the city, a big column of smoke was rising.
Sleheyron has a crater more,
someone said. Cowie got back on his feet and gave a short nod. The commander's right, he grumbled. The Sleheyron are using volcanic gas as energy supply for their artillery. If you hit those tanks with a proton bomb, you cause a fire wave and... A laser shot zipped by his right shoulder and scorched the armor. And while he was turning around and got on his knees, the other stormtroopers opened fire on the attackers. About a dozen of men and women of the Sleheyron militia had hidden behind some rocks and boxes in a side alley and was spraying the Imperials with heavy fire now. Hastily, Cowie looked around for an opportunity to retreat because on the open road they had no protection at all. And behind them, the militia was approaching as well. Cowie recognized that despite their advantage, the Sleheyron were panicking. They might win this fire exchange, but not the battle. Cowie was about to give order to storm out and fight their way back when the galaxy suddenly caught fire. Negative! Tio Man had wanted to shout out, but now that word left his mouth as a suffocated whisper. Red Ford, negative! He repeated quietly. A V-wing from his squadron had hit the road directly below Tio Man with a proton bomb. The clone pilot had seen that an Imperial unit got caught in the crossfire of two militia groups and had pulled the trigger. The impact had hit one of the Sleheyron groups and the shockwave had blown the other group to the ground. None of the stormtroopers that had been caught between them was moving anymore. Tio Man suppressed one of the curses he must have adopted in the last years. The new soldiers that had come from Camino obviously had no idea about the force of their weapons. This was no annihilation campaign, especially not against their own people. The attack plan the fighters and ground troops were following was a masterpiece, but it required extreme precision from every single man. Tio Man pulled the control stick hard to the right and moved his V-wing with a sharp turn. He had to know if any stormtrooper had survived this. The road got back into his vision field, where an almost unharmed group of Sleheyron was getting up again. Tio Man pressed the fire button as hard as he could and unleashed a hailstorm of laser beams. The road burst open as if it had only consisted of sand, and the militias that weren't vaporized were thrown into the air. A single stormtrooper had dragged himself back on his feet and threw an energy grenade into the impact field of the laser. Then he ducked as Tio Man's fighters swept across him and the corpses. Tio Man pulled his V-wing up and hoped that the stormtrooper would find his way back to the other units. He could not pick him up, cause right at this moment a command appeared on his display.
The Jedi is in Sector 423. Clearance for proton bomb.
Electrical shocks dazed all of Nokas Mepur's senses. Only slowly the world around him reappeared, and with it his enemy. The man whose armor reminded him so much of Jango Fett was still under him, but now punched him in the face and pushed Nokas away from him. Nokas rolled 2 meters over the floor and got back on his feet just in time to fight off the attacking Fett. Nokas stormed back into the fight and mobilized his last energy reserves to finally end the clash. Selene was being attacked by the Republic. Nokas had lost too much time already. If he didn't manage to defeat Fett soon, he wouldn't be able to save anyone in this house from the clones. One option remained. He let himself be pushed into a more defensive position and allowed himself to only give the persistent hitting and blocking moves half of his attention. Despite his fear, he still was in harmony with the Force and looked at the fight he was in as an organized chaos, as a complex entity with spatial and temporal dimensions. And while he used his knowledge of this entity to duck from a hard kick from his opponent, he sacrificed half of his attention to concentrate on the jetpack Fett was wearing on his back. When the fight had started, Fett had attacked him with one of the rockets from his jetpack. Now, Nokas knew about its structure, and if he could get one of those rockets to explode during flight, then... Nokas knew he was making a devastating mistake when it was too late already. Right in that moment, when he used the Force to reach inside the rockets to take away the insulations of the charges, the Force filled up with a howling. The world felt now like filled with water and had slowed down completely. But the seemingly sleeping time didn't change anything about the inevitability of things. Fett's jetpack exploded, and the fact that the flaming fireball seemed to expand in slow motion was no help to Nokas at all. Cause Nokas' body moved even slower than the fire. His thoughts alone traveled at light speed and said to him, "You have killed them." The world shook off its paralysis and speeded up again. Nokas and Fett were blown away and landed with burned armor and singed garments somewhere on the dirty floor. Nokas wanted to scream, but he couldn't. He wanted to go, wanted to pull back from the Force, and he did that so hastily and desperately that in his rage he gave Fett a huge blast of the Force, ripping tiles out of the floor and caused the tube lights of the ceiling to burst. Lurching, he got back on his feet. In the door where a second ago Fett had been standing, he now saw the dead body of a woman. 2 or 3 meters away, a 6-year-old boy had crouched behind a cooling unit. Galve Mepur had opened his eyes wide, looked at his father emotionlessly, and asked himself why his father had allowed the death of his mother. Nokas Mepur closed his eyes. Outside, he could feel the enemy troops that had the house surrounded now. In the distance, Tio Man's fighter veered away and deactivated the proton bomb. But Nokas didn't know about that. The battle was over. Sleheyron had fallen. Langkawi wanted to punch Tio Man in the face, but he knew that the stormtrooper's helmet could easily withstand at least one attack like that. His only option would have been to break the clone's neck, but then he would have been executed for treason, and the clone was just not worth that.
How's your unit?
Kawi snubbed at Tio Man.
Everyone got back okay?
He wanted to build himself up in front of him, but had to realize that the clone was taller than him. Let's hear it for the Caminoans, he thought with anger. At least with body heights they know what they're doing. I am sorry, Lieutenant, said Tio Man and took position in the row beside Kawi. Well over 300 soldiers and pilots had lined up on a site that had been cleared from debris. The rows had been arranged in concentric hexagons and had left the space in the center free. There, the commander's shuttle would land shortly.
Oh, no need for apologies.
Kawi snapped back without looking at the clone beside him.
The clone that dropped the bomb on my men has probably killed more today than you have in your entire career.
There was no answer from Tio Man. Kawi talked himself into rage.
Was that one of your incredible clone tactics? Very effective, really. Dropping a bomb on your own men, no one expects that.
Kawi knew he would better hold back before he completely lost his temper. But he couldn't. His men were dead. Just gone. Kawi turned around towards Tio Man. His face turned to an angry grin underneath his helmet when he said,
Order 66, Lieutenant. Was that intentionally? Or did you and your clone friends just lose your appetite for precision?
Lieutenant, I really don't know why.
Why you thought it was necessary to decimate my unit?
Kawi fired back.
Maybe you wanted to make it easier for the Jedi to escape. Then you will probably be disappointed to hear that he was captured, together with that bounty hunter, and by human soldiers.
The faint roar of the shuttle engines were coming from the sky now. The commanders were about to arrive, and the superior officers of the group troops checked one last time if every soldier was in his place. Tio Man and Kawi had to abandon their conversation, and only after a while it was Tio Man who broke the silence. I agree with you. said the clone lieutenant. "Something's wrong with Camino. The soldiers moving up from there are different. Nobody really seems to notice because of the first clones that fought at Geonosis. No one was alive anymore. But if you would place one of those beside one of these soldiers here..." Tio Man didn't finish the sentence. The shuttle had descended as far as the roofs of the houses now, and the engines were too loud for them to understand each other anymore. Kawi thought about the clone's words. The squadron leaders he had dealt with had all been arrogant and patronizing, even if they had the same rank as Kawi. He hadn't expected that Tio Man would agree with him. There was something wrong with the clones. There was a reason for the diligently fired missile. Camino noticeably delivered worse and worse quality. Tio Man tried not to be irritated by Kawi's attacks. He regretted Kawi's soldiers' fate, and he knew that as the squadron leader, he was responsible for human error of his pilots. What still bothered him though, was that Kawi wasn't even talking about human error, but rather about a clone defect. To Kawi, clones were more droids than human beings, and as such could not make mistakes. They could only be broken. While the commander's shuttle was touching down on the dusty ground, Tio Man asked himself if Kawi maybe was more correct about the clone defect than Tio Man wanted to admit. He had thought about what could be wrong with the new clones for weeks, but had always led it back to bad training and not to a genetic error. An error, it sounded in Tio Man's thoughts. A defect in our DNA. Maybe that was the reason. Maybe I have a defect, and that's why I saved Master Mepur back then on Kashyyyk. Tio Man was so engrossed in his thoughts about Nokas that he thought he could see him right in front of him. Nokas was standing on the other end of the square, surrounded by stormtroopers and dressed in the grey-red robes of the natives. Nokas' eyes seemed emotionless and glazed. Tio Man wanted to blink to pass away, but that didn't work. Covered by his helmet, his eyes opened wide when he realized that Nokas was real. The Jedi was actually here. After all these years, and with all the Jedi it could have hit, it had happened after all. The biggest possible disaster. They had captured Nokas Mepur. The thought that he had almost dropped a proton bomb on Nokas made him feel nauseous. At least that had not happened, he thought to himself. But that doesn't change the fact that the Empire had still managed to capture Nokas. And if they identify him, then they will ask which clone had reported and confirmed his death back then. Tio Man swallowed. After 7 years, his and Nokas' path crossed again. And now they were in bigger danger than ever before. He should have anticipated it. The commander that would leave the shuttle via the landing ramp in a few seconds had proven great skills as a strategist and tactician. From the moment that he had started his hunt for Jedis, it had only been a question of time when he would find one. And there was one. The commander is planning something, he had said to the squadron leader of the Blue Unit this morning. In the last months we took the same route several times, always taking detours to our destination. And now we travel through half the galaxy and find a planet that cannot be found on any of the charts and where there apparently is a Jedi. The other clone had shaken his head. Between you and me, Lieutenant, I think they will take away his rank soon. He's an eccentric who will have no future in the Empire. Tio Man pushed away these thoughts and raised his head again. Down the landing ramp, followed by 4 stormtroopers, walked a tall and slim man dressed in a captain's uniform. The commander had blue skin, and his eyes were glowing in an intense red that could be seen clearly from the distance. Captain Thrawn stepped in front of the prisoners. Bib Durka had a bad feeling about this. The Twi'lek would have preferred to stay in the shuttle, but there were stormtroopers in front of him and behind him, outside the shuttle 300 more, and the obviously with superhuman intelligence blessed Captain Thrawn topped off the threatening atmosphere perfectly. Durka tried to keep a neutral face and followed Thrawn and his 4 stormtroopers down the ramp. How could it have come to this? When he had started to work his way up in Crime Lord Jabba the Hutt's organization 7 years ago, he had certainly not meant to function as a transactor of the Empire. Where once corrupt politicians of the Republic had accepted any kind of support from the galactic underworld with thanks, were now the relentless and untouchable officers of the Empire. Smuggling business had become more rewarding, but also more dangerous under the new order, and Durka had always been glad that he had left all this behind him. Had he known back then that Jedi would actually succeed to make a pact with the Empire after all, he would not only have changed jobs, but also his client. "A work colleague?" Durka startled up. He had reached the end of the ramp now and had unfortunately stopped right beside Thrawn. His nervous, yellowish eyes first focused on the interested face of the captain, and then on the captives that were led in front of them. The man in the half-burned clothes had to be a Jedi. A bit further away, lying on the repulsor stretcher, was an about 6-year-old child. "No, not the boy," Durka heard Thrawn say. "I'm talking about Boba Fett." The Twi'lek winced, and in the same moment he recognized that among all those soldiers in their dirty armors, one suit only remotely looked like the ones of the Empire. Boba Fett, Jango's son, had previously been captured too and was standing upright and in energy cuffs between 2 stormtroopers. That was bad, Durka realized immediately. That was really bad. The Imperials had him in their pocket, and if anyone was able to draw the conclusion, it was Thrawn. "Let us recap what happened," the captain said, facing Durka. 7 years ago, Durka, at the same time of Order 66, you managed with a little trick to have this Jedi stranded on Sleheyron, a planet that has had no contact to the outer world for thousands of years and has since been forgotten, and in addition to that does not possess hyperspace-capable ships. Durka felt the touch of Nokas Mepur's stinging look, now that the Jedi knew who he had to thank for the years of captivity. He forced himself to ignore Mepur and to focus on Captain Thrawn instead, which may have been easier but not necessarily nicer. "You passed on this information to Jabba," Thrawn continued, "and used it to climb a few steps in his organization. Jabba kept this secret about the Jedi's whereabouts to himself and eventually sold it to me by sending the one man who knew about it anyway. You." Durka wanted to say something, but he couldn't think of anything that could stop Thrawn from making the correct conclusion. Especially as Thrawn had probably finished his thoughts already and was only explaining them again. "So we traveled to Sleheyron, according to Jabba's in your information, the location of the Jedi," Thrawn concluded. "We find the Jedi, but we also find Boba Fett, a bounty hunter, often in Jabba's service. Coincidentally also interested in Nokas Mepur and his capture." Thrawn paused for a moment. "Do I need to continue?" Durka shook his head. He had not known that Jabba would send Fett as well to catch the Jedi and have him brought away before the Empire reached Sleheyron. Durka had thought that Jabba would play fair. He should have known better. The Hutt had tried to make a deal with the Empire without paying for it. That had not worked. And even if Durka was not the one who had tried to betray Thrawn, unfortunately, he still was Jabba's messenger. "I think," Thrawn said, "it would be very inconsequent of me if I gave you the information Jabba asked me for in exchange for the Jedi's hideout. I think with Fett's presence here, Jabba wants to let me know that the deal is off." Durka settled with his fate. Thrawn waved an officer over to him. "Lieutenant Langkawi?" Kawi nodded respectfully.
Yes, sir?
"Put Durka in handcuffs. He is to be brought on board the Star Destroyer immediately, together with the Jedi child." Another officer stepped forward with an insecure expression on his face. Sir? The man started carefully. Prisoner transports usually are my responsibility, not that of a trooper. If I may... You may, but it is my decision what is your responsibility and what is not. Thrawn looked over to Nokas and Fett, both still guarded by stormtroopers. You will bring these two into my private shuttle, he said to the second officer. While the addressed soldier and Langkawi saluted, Thrawn added, They will keep us company for a while. The walk through the ruined Selene was not what Durka's upset conscience needed. Not only was it him who had stranded Nokas here 9 years ago, but also it was thanks to him that first Jabba and then the Empire got to know about it. And so, in these moments, it was difficult for him to just be the cold gangster and businessman he always wanted to be. He hadn't fired a single shot. He had only arrived after the battle was over. But could he really walk by the burned remains of what appeared to be a spiritual building and persuade himself that he had nothing to do with it? At a crossroad, Durka carefully looked over his shoulder where Langkawi's brief head movement made clear they would continue to the left. The stormtrooper, whose eyes Durka pictured in a cold blue, had a weapon in one hand, pointed at the Twi'lek, and used the other hand to direct the repulsor stretcher. The unconscious boy that was being transported on it, it was a stab into Durka's heart.
I couldn't have anticipated that,
he told himself over and over again.
How could I have known that the damn Jedi would start a family?
He felt helpless. Not only because of the painful handcuffs, but also because he had completely lost control over everything. Things he had done over 10 years ago turned out to have completely different consequences than he had expected. And what he would be doing now was totally up to the Empire and this terrible Thrawn. The latter could as well have let him go. Then Durka would have been executed by Jabba instead. Now that both the Empire as well as the Lawless wanted his death, where could he still show his face? The answer came in form of an Imperial Lambda shuttle marked O-185. Move on! Durka heard the stormtrooper behind him grumble as the Twi'lek stopped instinctively. The shuttle's ramp was moved out when the pilot saw them approach. As Durka was about to get inside, his walk got even wobblier than it already was. Inside the shuttle, the fact that he was a prisoner of an invincible empire now became a lot more obvious. The pilot walked out of his cockpit and helped Lieutenant Kawi to secure the stretch with the buy on it.
Okay,
Kawi said to the other Imperial.
I'm taking over from here. Report to one of the other shuttles as a navigator.
The pilot looked a bit baffled, but obeyed without another word. When the man had left the ramp, Kawi said nothing for a while. He seemed to be waiting for the pilot to turn around the next corner. Then he eventually lowered his weapon and deactivated Durka's handcuffs. The Twi'lek's mouth dropped.
So then,
Kawi explained, and he sounded like he was smiling under his helmet.
You know how to fly a ship?
Durka nodded in disbelief.
Then give my regards to Jabba, that old crook.
Lieutenant Langkawi turned around to walk away.
Tell him if I have to free more, then I want more money.
He added and then stepped down the ramp, not turning around again. Left behind was a perplexed Twi'lek. Had Jabba really planted a spy in Thrawn's armed forces? Anyway, Durka knew how to fly a shuttle. He had had his own ship before. He would get away from here. He would escape the Imperial vaporization. But while the ramp was closing up and Durka jammed himself into the tight cockpit, his mood dropped again. There was no way he could return to Jabba because of course Thrawn had not honored Jabba's betrayal with a payment. Where should he go? He couldn't spend his whole life fleeing from Jabba and the Empire. He had to offer the Hutt something. Some kind of compensation. Something. He turned around.
The Jedi boy,
he said out loud, and all the regret of the last half hour was forgotten. Coruscant. You fight. The ice blue blade of the lightsaber dances up and down in front of your eyes. Again and again it hits the metallic guard's vibro sword. When you hit him, when only one of your strikes pierces the droid's armor, you win. And if his vibro sword hits you, you may lose an arm, maybe an inner organ, even your life. One of these possibilities will become reality. Maybe in a moment, maybe just now. You pull up your free hand and unleash the Force. The air compresses and becomes lethal. A flickering ball of wind that hits the droid's metallic alloy with incredible power. Black paint chips away. The torso dents in. But the droid fights on, pushes you back into the defense.
I'm almost there, Nilas.
Sweitt shouts in the same moment that a dull smack announces the end of the last of the secondary guards, the small droids that Sweitt had been fighting. You wanted the big one for yourself, and that hasn't changed. You put more momentum into your attacks. This droid here is not a normal one. You have known that since you felt him in the Force the first time. The droid is guarding a source of dark energy. That can mean only one thing. The energy is usable, valuable. The bigger the guard, the bigger the treasure. You let yourself fall a little. Bend your knees and pull the sword arm of the droid over you. Intensify its movement. Make it wider than the droid's algorithms had been designed for. The droid loses its balance above you. You hold your breath and push the gleaming blade of your sword up directly into the droid's core. You feel the first whirl of a force wave and you understand the warning. You boost the droid into the air, almost all the way to the ceiling of the Dark Depot, where it bursts like a small sun. For half a second, this part of the stronghold is flooded with light, then darkness is back and you start breathing again.
Those were the last ones,
Sweitt said and deactivated his sword.
And it really does look like there were no living guards here, only droids.
We are in a nexus of dark energy, you say, and you stab your sword into the steel door that leads to the next room. Living guards wouldn't last very long here.
Same counts for me.
Sweitt noted, and his face suggested that he felt more than uncomfortable. Without looking at your friend, you say, for the last few months we have learned to breathe the poisonous air of Coruscant's underworld. We adapted. We got better. The door is now broken open. If we have to, we will breathe the darkness. You step through the new hole, making sure not to touch the glowing edges, and finally enter the small chamber that forms the heart of this secret fortress. There, on a black socket, you see a snow-white mask. You take a deep breath. Camino. He arrived at midnight. Lama Su, Camino's prime minister, had studied reports from Imperial commanders until deep into the night, not suspecting what would be in store for him. Although all reports sounded the same and almost all of them were complaints, he had skimmed every single one of them. Poor quality of clones, rapidly decreasing battle capabilities, numerous defects to report. Lama Su had been explained one and the same problem in many different ways by dozens of commanders. When his tiredness had reached a certain point, he was tempted for a moment to just say, Camino knows about it. Camino doesn't care. But it was too early for that still. They needed to gain a little more time. The Empire needed to believe for a little bit longer that deficits were unintended errors that Camino's research facilities worked extremely hard on to correct. It was an advantage, Lama Su had found out, when you're the only expert on your subject. Because if the Caminoans couldn't solve the problem, who else out there would be confident enough to even try to find a solution? Around midnight then, death announced his imminent visit. Lama Su startled up from his lethargy, alarmed by the hollow alert signals that sounded through the whole of Tipoca City. With a hissing sound, the door of his chamber disappeared into the wall, and the slim shape of Admiral Rap Woofer, a cold and lifeless Imperial, emerged. Woofer was the supreme commander of the stormtroops and the TIE squadrons that the Empire had stationed around Tipoca City. Officially, they were there to protect the clone factories from attacks that had happened at the beginning of the Clone Wars. Unofficially, every member of Camino's government knew this. Woofer and his soldiers were here to make sure the Camonians obeyed and didn't break the Empire's back.
A ship has been detected,
Woofer said, and again showed no sense for courtesies.
It jumped directly to the gravitational field of the planet and is entering our upper atmosphere right now.
Our atmosphere? Lamassu was about to reply, but then decided to swallow his dislike of Woofer. Are they answering to our radio messages? The Prime Minister said while getting up from his chair. Woofer shook his head.
We doubt that they can. We're not even sure there are people on board.
Lamassu didn't allow himself to show surprise in front of Woofer, but inside, he was as agitated as he hadn't been in a long time. A single ship may have been insignificant, but it added an unpredictable component to a well-thought-through plan. The dangerous game that Camino, that Lamassu, was playing with the Empire, could only be won if no meeples turned up that he was completely unaware of. A ghost ship? The Prime Minister asked in a neutral tone.
In every aspect, yes. Half of the ship is missing. The fact that the hyperspace drive is still working seems incredible considering the damage. The sublight engines? Well, they're gone.
The normally so dismissive Woofer was visibly confused. Lamassu stepped past him directly towards the door. There has to be a way to identify the ship.
Exactly that is the big mystery. We have already identified it.
And?
It's the Invisible Hand, General Grievous battleship.
A few minutes later, Admiral Woofer was standing outside on a wide balcony. The roof had been retracted so that the Caminoans and the Imperials on the balcony could look up into the sky. The Invisible Hand, if it really was here, was heading directly towards Tipoca City. At least this information from the sensors could be trusted, Woofer thought. He and Camino's Minister of Defense Vidar had every troop, fighter squadron and piece of artillery half prepared for battle. Still, the Invisible Hand had not replied to any of the radio contacts, and Woofer was not sure how close he should let them get before he would give the order to shoot them down. A small dark dot was now diving through the stormy clouds, and it was getting bigger fast. From a pocket of his rain-soaked uniform, Woofer picked a laser field glass and pointed it towards the ghost ship. And indeed, on its display he could clearly make out the almost melted hull. What was coming down from the sky was not a normal munificent class. No, it really was the Hand. She had crashed over Coruscant about 10 years ago and had damaged her hull. Woofer himself had been there commanding a small team of corvettes. What was the ship doing here? How come it was flying? And who was flying it? A squadron of TIE fighters took off and speeded dangerously close past the balcony with their roaring twin ion engines. A few Caminoans took a frightened step back. The war may have become their business because of their production of clones, but directly on their doorstep they didn't appreciate it very much. Woofer had not much but despite left for them. On his list of mortal enemies, only the presumed dead Confederation and Camino's stormy reign were ahead of them. So this was more or less a summit of everything he hated. The Invisible Hand now was so close that she could be seen with the naked eye, and a murmur went through the crowd. Woofer, on the other hand, who had made sure that the ship was genuine himself, noticed something completely different. No engine noise could be heard. There was the raging storm, but nothing from the ship itself. And it was way too slow to be crashing. Woofer grunted quietly.
100,000 howling craft dogs,
he grumbled. He didn't care about the Caminoan that was giving him a horrified look. The murmur among the Caminoan and Imperial observers grew louder when the ghost ship slowed down about a kilometer above the city and finally came to a stop, hovering in its place. A few Caminoans left the balcony and went back into the elusive shelter of the adjacent corridor. Woofer's pulse accelerated. It would take less than 10 seconds to reach for the comlink and give the TIE fighters that were circling the city the order to attack. Almost no intact weapon systems had been detected aboard the ship, but if the Hand was able to fly without engines, why shouldn't it be able to melt on Tipoca City and sink it into the depths of the ocean, and with it the clone facilities? He decided that he had had enough.
Admiral Woofer to Squadrons 4 to 12.
He spoke into his comlink slow and clear.
Clearance for attack.
Intoxicated by its power, Nilas Dihr just let himself fall. Half a heartbeat earlier, he had jumped out of one of the vents that once led to dozens of escape capsules. But now he was in a free fall and had left the invisible Hand above him. His flowing black robes followed him like the tail of a comet, and his face was hidden behind that white mask he had found that time on Coruscant. Once again, he had made a pact with death. And death paid well. A tiny thought was enough to first bring Nilas into an upright position, and then to slow down his fall and turn it into some kind of godlike descent. Nilas floated through Camino's stormy rain towards the with tiny light spots studded silhouette of Tipoca City. He slid into the depth, and for the first time in a while, he felt really good. Somewhere behind the rainy curtain, he heard the engines of TIE fighters. During his years in Coruscant's Undercity, Nilas had seen a few TIEs every now and then when the fighters would fly extremely low for search purposes. He didn't know too much about those Imperial fighters, but he didn't have to either. Is it important what kind of bloodstream insects have if you can squash them either way? With the inexhaustible forces the spirit of the mask was giving him, Nilas let his senses wander and his awareness increase. He found almost 100 TIE fighters, all in different distances to the invisible Hand. They didn't seem to have detected him yet. That did make sense, as he was only one man dressed in black amidst a stormy night sky, but it was not very polite. Nilas smiled. He concentrated and used the Force to amplify his voice many times. Nilas Dihr was louder than the rolling thunder when he had the mercy to explain their doom to the mortals. "My Imperial friends," he said. "Maybe you remember the Jedi Order that protected you for thousands of years, and that you have betrayed and murdered." With long-anticipated satisfaction, he felt the fear of the creatures crawling in the blackness underneath him. "Now I want to illustrate to you with a practical example." And now he was shouting, that was a very bad idea!" And with a grin on his face, he added, "A bit of knowledge should brighten up your day." He took a deep breath, and then he started. A TIE fighter exploded, and the resulting wave of fire turned the hulls of the two wingmen into glowing comets. There had been no enemy fire, no collision, nothing. The fighter had just been torn apart, like by an invisible hand. The fighters behind evaded and opened fire on the dark ghost ship. Parts of the hull burst open, but nothing else happened. Neither did some hidden cannon batteries come to life, nor did the invisible Hand start to move. Instead, a sudden push went through a whole squadron of TIE fighters, pulled them out of their flight path and towards each other, like being pulled by a giant magnet. A ball of TIE fighters emerged, compressed more and more, and ultimately ceased to be. At the same time, the rain started to rearrange itself. The raindrops had stopped shooting towards the rough ocean surface like shimmering lines, but were moving in completely new ways. Accompanied by an increasing number of exploding Imperial fighters, rings of rain lines were forming and were building up to a more and more complex object. Soon it could even be seen from the viewing platforms down in Tipoca City that these gigantic rings were surrounding one certain point, almost like planet rings around the sun. And now that the actual rain stayed in the air, it was replaced by something a lot more impressive. A hailstorm of melted TIE fighters was coming down over Tipoca City. Admiral Rapt Woofer put back his comlink after he had shouted orders throughout the last few minutes. From here, he realized that now he couldn't do anything. He needed to get off the balcony and somehow break his way through the crowds of rushing soldiers and panicking Caminoans, through to the commando stand. Violently, he pushed himself past an older Caminoan whose neck bent dangerously. Stormtroopers were gathering at the exits and fired a few warning shots into the night sky to restore order.
Good.
Woofer thought, and almost didn't see the clone soldiers that, dressed in old armors from the time of the war, suddenly appeared on the balcony and behaved so different from the Imperial troops.
What does that mean?
He wanted to shout to them when suddenly a loud alarm sounded, which could only mean one thing. Prime Minister Lama Su himself was addressing the city's population. And Lama Su only said one word. Scorpion. The shot of a stormtrooper hit Woofer directly in his chest, and before he realized what had happened, he was dead. Nilas was running out of ideas. The pushing together of the TIE squadrons to a big ball had been his favorite use of his new powers. The plain old blows with the Force and the crushing of the ion engines had almost lost their excitement. He had just thrown a few TIE fighters into the ocean because it just looked nice when the flames poured over the surface of the water. On the other hand, that all happened much too far away from him to be able to see it in detail. The spirit of the mask let him feel the death of the pilots, but the passing of strangers wasn't really satisfying either. Vader and Palpatine. Their death certainly would be amazingly beautiful, but they weren't here, and therefore the galaxy would have to wait for its balance a little longer. Nevertheless, Nilas knew exactly what he had to do. He knew what the revenge of the Jedi had to look like. It started on Camino, and it would end on Coruscant. Surprised, he deflected a few green laser shots to the side that were undoubtedly meant for him. Obviously, the giant rings of force-driven raindrops that surrounded Nilas had given the Imperials the crucial clue as to who was decimating their squadrons. With a quick wave of his hand, Nilas ripped the hexagonal solar sail off the two approaching TIE fighters, only to push them into the ball-shaped cockpits with all force. Fighter and pilot ended in the fire. Stranger. Nilas suddenly heard a voice speaking with a Caminoan accent. This is Lama Su speaking, Prime Minister of Camino. We do not know on whose side you are, but if your rage is directed at the Empire, then we hope that we are not guilty ourselves. Nilas stopped and looked down on Tipoca City. Again, Lama Su's voice sounded from the city speakers. As you can see, at this moment our soldiers are turning against the station stormtroops. We want to cast off the Imperial bondage, and if you spare us, we will support you in your campaign. Nilas folded his hands. An organized clone rebellion against the Empire? That was even better than what he had hoped for. I think, he said, we have a deal. Coruscant. You're breathing heavier than normal. You're not sure why. Maybe you're just exhausted from the many long marches in the last months. From all the battles against underworld gangsters, from the always resurging escape from the Empire that is growing stronger year by year. Maybe breathing is so hard because the air is still filled up with poison, wherever you go. It is also possible that the ancient Sith artifact in your backpack is partly responsible for your lungs being filled with stuffy cold air. Sweitt had offered to carry the white mask in his backpack for a while. You had refused. Whatever this mask is, and whoever had hidden it where you found it, now it belongs to you, and the voices that echoed inside of it could be the key to avenge the Jedi. Maybe a price would have to be paid for this revenge, and maybe it would be you who would be asked for it. But that would be okay. It wouldn't be the first time. Sweitt and you had been following strange rumors for a few days now. A few scrap dealers were talking about a place that apparently had a great amount of spare parts available. They themselves had never been there, and reportedly there were several security teams there. But almost all merchants agreed that something important had to be located there, something big. You didn't need to know anymore. It was the same as with the mask. The more guards, the bigger treasure. The higher the price, the more valuable is what you acquire. An hour ago, you had entered the labyrinth of tunnels that existed in Coruscant's underworld in the thousands. Sweitt was against it, like so often. But he too knows that you can't continue living like this forever. If at the end of this labyrinth there was something that would turn you from being the hunted into being the hunters, then it would be worth the search and the try for Sweitt too. Now you were groping your way through semi-darkness, using removed light tubes as light sources because a lightsaber would be a devastating clue to what you once were. You can feel the guards. You can see how they move through the different levels of this complex. They are well equipped, heavily armed, but in their thoughts you can feel resignation, even desperation. They have been down here for too long and the complex is too big for a dozen guards. You ask yourself if the one who had hidden the treasure down here may have forgotten about.
Repulsors,
Sweitt says eventually. And at your questioning look he adds,
members of my species can notice the vibrations that occur at the use of repulsors. And they are very rare in the lowest city. But ahead of us...
You understand. Come on, you say and check for your lightsaber that you have hidden under your torn robes. You move further and further. By now you doubt that you will ever find the way out again, but eventually you suppress that fear. And at some point, one of the corridors ends on an observation platform. Beneath this platform, a giant repulsor grid had been installed. Floating inside of it are the remains of a once so powerful battleship of the Confederation, the Invisible Hand. Imperial Space Station, Rati Adamant 7. Boba Fett started to get worried. In the 23 years of his life, he had been captured twice already. The first time in an asteroid prison, he had used a riot for his escape. The second time, his reputation at Jabba had already been good enough for him to arrange his release. Fett had to work off all the costs of that, but at least his relationship to Jabba had not been damaged. That healthy mix of hate and respect for each other was still intact. Now, however, he had spent several days sitting in a cell on the space station Rati Adamant 7 that Captain Thrawn's Star Destroyer had docked to. Fett could only vaguely remember a report of this station that he had read a few months back. It was armed relatively poor, but on the other hand its dimensions were so gigantic and most of the time so many battleships were docked to it that there was no real need for separate weapon systems. It was very unlikely that Jabba would be able to get him out of here by force. Maybe Thrawn would be bribable, but after the plan with Nokas Mepur had not worked out, the Hutt would probably not be too enthusiastic about the thought of losing money on top of the Jedi now. Fett had no idea about the exact terms of the deal between Thrawn and Jabba. Jabba had obviously received information on the whereabouts of Nokas Mepur, but Fett could only assume what Jabba would have gotten in return. A few legal concessions would probably have been of most interest to the Hutt, but as Thrawn only held the rank of a captain, his possibilities there were probably very limited. In addition, his feeling told Fett that a few aspects of this deal were lying deeper in the dark. Thrawn's way of handling the Twi'lek Durka, for example, had been more than strange. Fett stopped his reflections when the door of his cell was suddenly pushed open. From the dimly lit corridor, Admiral Thrawn himself stepped into the from artificial green light flooded chamber and closed the door behind him. Thrawn carried an openly visible blaster gun, which made it clear to Fett that Thrawn had not brought guards.
Thrawn,
Fett said in a neutral tone. As he was neither wearing his helmet nor his armor, his voice was not being distorted. The captain nodded at him and waited until Fett had gotten up from his prison bed. I see the medics have sorted you out. Thrawn nodded briefly.
They have.
The medical staff has probably gotten familiar with clones and injuries inflicted by Jedi.
Let's save our words, Thrawn.
Agreed. I'm here to make you an offer. If you comply, I will bring you back home. Fett blinked. He found it difficult to read from his counterpart's face that was so dominated by these horrible eyes.
You mean you let me go?
He said reluctantly. That's part of it, yes. Thrawn nodded. I want you to do something for me. Should you be successful, and should you survive, then you're a free man, and can give Jabba a hand again. A hint of disgust became visible in Thrawn's face. If you really feel like it.
You want me to kill someone?
Fett relaxed a bit. Mostly that was what people wanted. And he knew better than anyone else that life and death were the giant pillars supporting the galaxy.
Where do I go?
As I already said, home. Only now Fett realized what the Imperial was aiming for.
You're talking about Camino.
Exactly. Thrawn folded his arms behind his back. Obviously, he didn't think of Fett as dangerous anymore. If he ever was within this cell. Even if he did get out of here, he still would have to defeat hundreds of stormtroopers. Doable, but a bit too risky. Thrawn continued. We have recently learned that Camino has been building a secret clone army for some time that is designed for a rebellion against the Empire. At the same time, Camino has supplied the Imperial army with soldiers of lower quality to weaken us. We also have reason to believe that the battle efficiency of the new Camino and clones is clearly superior to ours. Fett wrinkled his forehead. That all sounded a bit out of touch with reality.
A single planet against the whole Empire?
Thrawn shook his head. You know as well as myself, Fett, that the Imperial propaganda can create random realities. And the myth of our superiority is part of that. We are the biggest force in the galaxy, yes. But only because the countless small rebellions on several planets are not reported on in the holonet, that doesn't mean they don't exist. Fett said. Of course he had heard about several uprisings, especially in the last few months. But he hadn't thought that an Imperial officer would admit to himself and to others that there was a real danger for the Empire. Did all Imperials think like that? Or was it only Thrawn? Is it possible that Camino has joined forces with other planets? Secret contracts and confederacies, assassinations disguised as accidents. Their methods are obvious. Fett decided to get back to the point.
So, you want me to kill Lama Su?
I want you to lead my ground forces, Thrawn replied. Fett perked his eyebrows. You grew up there, and you spent more time there than any quickly matured clone. We can't use too many of the latter anyway, as many of them show defects.
So, I serve you Tipoca City on a plate, and in exchange you will let me go.
Fett repeated. He compressed his lips to a thin line. After a short break he said,
The same old problem. How will I know you'll keep your promise?
Thrawn smiled. What do you care, Fett? We both know that you will clear away after the battle before I have a chance to catch you. Technically, I'm not entitled to let a prisoner go anyway. He turned around to leave. The offer is this. If you make the taking of Tipoca possible for me, then I won't be in your way any longer and we will not hear from each other again.
Good. I'm in.
Thrawn nodded, and the deal was done. Up until a week ago, Nokas Mepur was able to make himself believe that the rest of the galaxy didn't exist any longer, that the sky over Sleheyron was the limit and nothing existed beyond that. But then the Empire had arrived, and suddenly, what was below the sky was where emptiness was making its way into. Nokas didn't even know what had happened to Sleheyron. Maybe they all were there. Maybe the Republic, the Empire, had withdrawn without taking further lives. Or the soldiers were still there and were establishing the reign of violence. Whichever fate the people were facing, Nokas hoped that it was less severe than what he and his family had suffered from. His wife was dead, his son and himself were prisoners of the Empire, and thus also dead very soon. Was that the punishment? Nokas asked himself. Was the Force punishing him for having turned his back on the past and on the galaxy by making both fight back with all severity? He fiercely bit his lips. Not very likely, he thought. The betrayal had started with the Force, not him. And if it was the will of the Force to declare open season on all its servants throughout the galaxy, then it shouldn't be surprised if Nokas drew the consequences from that. Maybe that's why he hadn't foreseen the Imperial attack on Sleheyron? Because his connection to the Force was disturbed. Was that why his wife had to die? Because he, Nokas, was not a Jedi anymore. The last question could be answered with yes in two different ways. Had he not misused the Force, he may have been able to save his wife. Would he have followed the rules of the Jedi, he would never have married her and therefore never have put her in danger in the first place. Stop it, he said to himself. If he finished his thoughts, they led him to an even darker place than the one he was in now. He had to get away from here. He needed to find out where they had brought his son. Galve was not on the space station. Nokas had already searched the Force's structures for him long ago. The cell door suddenly opened and the Imperial captain with the blue skin and the red eyes stepped inside. Thrawn, that was his name, if Nokas remembered correctly. Nokas tried hard not to burn himself in the rage that was rising inside of him. Thrawn was responsible for everything that had happened, for all the death and destruction. Nokas Mepur, Thrawn said quietly. It seems the rumors about your death were exaggerated. Tio Man, that was the name that entered Nokas' mind in this moment. If the Empire knew that Nokas was alive, then they also knew that Tio Man had lied. Had they already arrested him? Was he even still alive? Why are you here? Nokas asked the red-eyed captain. We need to talk, Thrawn answered. Talk? About what? Thrawn sat down on a small chair that had been embedded into the wall, folded his hands and bent forward a bit like a long, important conversation was lying ahead. What do you need to talk about? Nokas repeated impatiently. Thrawn answered with an infinite composure. You could maybe call it the Force Shadow effect. Coruscant. You had imagined the way into the inside of the Invisible Hand to be a lot more difficult. Sweitt had had a bad feeling about this once again. But what does he know about bad feelings, since you are the one who has to carry the mask with you all the time? What use was it that he wanted to take it off you if he wasn't even able to take it? The darkness would suffocate him. It is difficult to breathe the darkness, but you can learn it, and you are on a good way. Your path through the Hand's corridors brings back memories. You have been on a ship like this before. It seems to be years ago, But you still remember clearly being part of the boarding squad. Part of a collective, part of something big. A Jedi. The familiar feeling of hatred, the rage about the clone's betrayal is coming back, and now you can continue. You lead Sweitt to the places where you think you remember the bridge of a ship like this to be. Everything is run down. Sometimes it's destroyed so badly that you have to take detours. But an hour later, you have reached the bridge, and you both sit down to think about what needs to be done next.
She won't fly anymore.
Sweitt is telling you what you already know.
The repulsor field is keeping her afloat and is keeping the hull stable. But the hand is not able to move by itself anymore.
We need... You think and say out the words. More force.
What good would a battleship be for us?
Sweitt asks.
Here, in Coruscant's undercity.
You impatiently shake your head. Can Sweitt not see how magnificent it was where you are now? If it was able to fly and was fit for action, we could hit the Empire from the inside, from here. We could run it into the Imperial Palace. We could strike the Imperials where they have no cover, far behind their lines. You are intoxicated now. You want this ship. Now. You don't ask for the price, you only ask who you have to pay it to. And in this moment, the mask in your backpack submits a proposition from a distant world. Death is making you an offer. It can make the ship come to life again, if it gets a life in exchange for it. You look at Sweitt. You take one last deep breath. Tipoca City, Camino. Nilas Dihr was sitting on one of the viewing platforms of Tipoca City and asked himself what had happened to Sweitt's dead body. He had left it on the Invisible Hand's bridge, hadn't touched it again. He wanted the stench as his punishment. Then eventually, during the incident in the asteroid field near Camino, the panorama windows had been destroyed by those weird creatures and the suction had pulled Sweitt into open space. What might have happened then? Would the creatures have eaten the corpse? What kind of critters were they anyway? Why did they have such a confusing link with the Force? Nilas got up. He had no time for the past right now. It wouldn't take long till the Empire found out about Camino's treason. New clones were still maturing in the secret chambers of Tipoca City. And now that this didn't happen secretly anymore, the central maturing facilities had also been realigned and activated. Had the production of a clone taken 10 years before the war, now this could be done within a few months. They needed time. Everything had been arranged. Everything was in development. They just needed to manage to put the Empire off long enough. Maybe it would take a few more days until the first Star Destroyer arrived here. Again, a few days after that, a small fleet would gather in the orbit and the attack would begin. If Nilas and the Caminoans could fight off that first wave, they would have gained a lot. Not only that new forces would first have to be brought into the system, but also the Imperial Senate would have to decide if Camino was really worth effort. If the answer was yes, then everything would be open. If the answer was no, then enough worlds could unite to a rebellion and Camino would get the needed months to build a second giant clone army. Nilas pushed the thought aside. Since when was he so restless and distracted? First he had to think about Sweitt in old times, then about interstellar rebellions and possible future lines. The here and now deserved his full attention. Within the Force he looked out, still enriched by the powers of the mask. The Caminoans were in an uproar. He felt that. The clones were calm, especially the younger ones. Still, the armies had been on constant high alert for days. In his mind, Nilas observed the shield generator, an enormous apparatus connected to a generator grid on the central city island. The shield was not activated, but in the case of emergency, it would take less than 10 seconds until the whole city was covered under a protective energy balloon. During the early days of the Clone Wars, it had played an important part in the city's defense, and Nilas startled. Someone was there. Someone was in the city. A few even, more than 20 intruders, deep in the city's intestines. "They're here!" Nilas shouted. And the mask made his voice sound all over the city. "The Empire!" Then suddenly he lost the ground under his feet. The lines of rain turned into floating bullets. The clone guards at the end of the platform were already hovering over the wet durasteel. The gravity, it was gone. Followed by a full metallic sound, the gravitation boots stuck onto the snow-white floor of the corridor. Boba Fett took a few test steps, then nodded satisfied. He could have used his jetpack to fly through the depths of the now gravitation-free city, but he wanted to save fuel. This could become a very long night. He turned around to the two commanders, who both were in control of 12 soldiers, all equipped with gravitation boots.
The hidden path into the city was no challenge. But now they know we're here. I hear the shield generator start up.
Lankawi pointed the barrel of his E-11 gun at the burning room they had just left.
The repulsors are overclocked. Not much longer till they blow up. But until then, our rebellious friends are helplessly floating around.
Fett looked over to the second commander, a clone called Tio Man. Tio Man stayed calm. How would it feel for a soldier to return to Tipoca City? He had felt weird about it himself, even though his father had only brought him here a few times. Anyway, he thought, and changed the energy pack of his blaster.
Advance to the shield generator.
He ordered the 12 clones and the 12 human soldiers.
Your boss is counting on us.
Orbit over Camino. The blue twirls of the hyperspace poured into the black emptiness, and when the fighter had completely entered the real space, the stars could be seen again. At least that's what Darth Vader was assuming. Because as advanced as his mechanical sight enhancers may have been, since his rebirth, stars didn't look the same anymore. Just like small dots of light, not much different to the control lights of his armor suit or the sun's reflection in a surveillance satellite. Vader's hands were flying over the controls and initialized the procedure that disconnected the TIE fighter from the hyperspace ring. During that, the cockpit of the small fighter was given a shake for a moment, until Vader stepped in with the Force and gently detached the connections. In moments like this, he wished back two things: his old Jedi starfighter and his sensitivity at using the Force. Irrelevant memories, Vader thought. There's no way back. The past is dead, and nothing will bring it back. He pushed the controller forward and loosened the safety bolt from the steering pad to pull it a bit towards him. Some things are lost forever, and it makes no sense to mourn about it, he assured himself. Some things, on the other hand, were certainly not lost yet. Back then, during the attack on the Jedi Temple, a dying week-old Jedi Master had taken his pride away from him. Raza Tabula's pupil, a young man called Nilas Dihr, had plundered his secret subterranean hideout a few weeks ago and had taken the snow-white mask that Vader was hiding from the Emperor. Vader had lost two things, the mask and his pride. The key to both would be Nilas Dihr's dead body. Once Nilas was dead, he would have gotten a lot closer to annihilating all of Master Tabula's Padawan breed. Then he would only need to find Nokas Mepur. But if Vader wasn't mistaken, Nilas was in possession of the mask, and the mask alone meant victory over the Emperor. And so my chains are breaking. Vader took a deep breath, let air flow through his metallic breathing apparatus. The waters of the blue planet Camino were lying in front of him, and he steered his modified TIE fighter directly towards one point where dark grey clouds were forming a whirl. The mask wanted to be found, and it had put the right mood for Vader's arrival over Tipoca City. Imperial Venator. A feeling of tension was lying over the bridge of Thrawn's Venator-class Star Destroyer. The elements were raging on the other side of the panorama window. Rain and clouds were struggling against the flames and the force of the heat shield. The deflectors had been activated and were running on full power, enabling the ship to dive into the lower atmosphere at this speed. Nokas Mepur had never been to Camino. His former master, on the other hand, did. Raza Tabula, who had died during the execution of Order 66, had been a good friend of the Jedi called Sifo-Dyas. Because of this, as Nilas had learned during a confidential conversation, Tabula had been able to visit the clone army during its production. Nokas hadn't known anything about those visits. His master had at first not wanted to tell him more, and then the war had broken out and had led Nokas away from the temple for a long time.
Captain, the convoy ships are reporting that they have to slow down.
A young Imperial officer was calling from the sensor station. Nokas had just detected him in the computer-seamed trench of the bridge when he added,
Apparently the weather conditions are a lot worse than expected.
A few meters away from Nokas, Thrawn acknowledged with a nod. That is nothing that could endanger our plan. Nokas cringed. Whatever all this meant, he didn't like it. Nokas was a prisoner. His hands were in energy handcuffs that would give him an electric shock if he moved away from the bridge area. The risk of Nokas attacking the bridge crew wasn't too high, but the Jedi felt that the reason for the about 30 Imperial officers' nervousness was not only the apparent battle, but also his presence. Thrawn was paying a high price by accepting this.
The scanners are reporting that the city's shield has been activated.
A second officer announced.
Same counts for the repulsor field.
Nokas only listened with half an ear. It had been 2 days now since Thrawn let him in on the Force Shadow phenomenon. Afterwards, the Imperial had explained why it was so important that Nokas would be on the bridge during the battle. The part of the plan that involved Nilas alone was remarkable. Thinking about how the whole plan had to be a lot more complex than this, he didn't even want to know by how many months Thrawn could have shortened the war. When the islands of Tipoca City appeared behind the window of the bridge, Nokas had to blink. In the stormy rain, the dome-shaped security shield of the city was glowing in a glaring blue. Steam was ascending wherever a drop hit the energy layer. Nokas had expected something similar, but what was faintly becoming visible underneath the shield took his breath away. Water bubbles of all sizes were floating around there as if the city was just a miniature model in a snow globe. The gravity didn't seem to be working anymore, and had soldiers and fighters helplessly hovered through the night sky. By the pillars of the galaxy, Nokas whispered. Thrawn turned around. It's a pleasure to impress a Jedi. Nokas looked past him, fascinated by the bizarre spectacle outside. How's that possible? He asked quietly. How did the strike forces manage to disable the gravitation? A wall display showed that the convoy ships had caught up with the Venator. Thrawn looked at it briefly, then he turned to Nokas again. Tipoca City is an enormous construction, the blue-skinned Imperial explained. It weighs a lot more than the supporting pillars can sustain over a long time, not even talking about the sometimes severe weather conditions. Therefore, there's a very powerful super repulsor in the central city island that decreases the city's weight. Thrawn made a dismissive gesture. A simple concept. You know it from the many landable battleships. Only with the support of the repulsors can their fleet carry a whole Star Destroyer. Nokas listened quietly while the snow globe city was getting closer and closer behind that panorama window. There were TIE fighters visible at the edge of the screen now, flying close to the Venator's hull and towards the city with their roaring engines. In Coruscant's Undercity, for example, Thrawn continued, the invisible hand has been stored in a repulsor grid for many years. This is one of the Emperor's secrets, but now that she's gone, it may be revealed. Anyway, repulsors work with anti-gravity units, and our strike force, led by Fed, has overclocked Tipoca City's repulsors. Thrawn smiled. They don't only reduce the city's weight, they also disable the gravity around it, until they burn out. Ah, Nokas said uncertain. And now? Now we need to break through the shield. This will take very long with conventional lasers, especially as we only have one Star Destroyer available. Thrawn pressed a button on the command console, and in the next moment, a holographic image of the city and the protective shield appeared in the black area of the bridge, about 2 meters in front of Nokas. Can you see how some of the water bubbles slowly get through the shield? Thrawn asked. Nokas nodded silently. It has been set up to defend laser fire, not water. Now Nokas understood. Prepare tractor beam, Thrawn instructed. Camino. Zero gravity. During his time as a Padawan in a different time, as a different being, Nilas had completed several hours of space training. He had taken a walk on the hull of a consular-class cruiser. The lightsaber training in the Fergaso asteroid field was one of the hardest physical lessons he could remember. What was happening in Tipoca City and its immediate airspace now was just bizarre and devastating. Bubbles of water, some the size of a small spaceship, had risen from the ocean. Camino and clone soldiers were floating around helplessly. It probably was no different for the soldiers and Caminos in the center of the city. Nilas saw a group of unmanned fighters hanging above the hangar platform. Only a few had led off the fight against the approaching small Imperial fleet. Manned fighters, of course, were still able to deal with zero gravity and were already outside the city's shield and on a defense flight. A few soldiers had jetpacks and were helping those who didn't. Some of the latter were simply holding on to each other and were being brought back to the city by the jet troopers, where they could hold on to something. This was total chaos, and neither Nilas nor the Caminoans had expected anything like this. Nilas slightly withdrew from the Force when the whole spectacle and the confusion became a bit too much for him. This was the downside of his Jedi senses. The connection always worked both ways. The fear and helplessness of the soldiers could infect him like a disease if he wasn't careful. And it was the same with the mask, but he wasn't even thinking about that anymore. Using the Force, he lowered himself down to the platform again. Close to him, a clone soldier was clinging to a fitted floodlight and could hardly be seen behind the pillar of light.
Sir, what are your orders?
He shouted over, but Nilas didn't pay much attention because beyond the dome something strange happened. The Venator Star Destroyer that was approaching the city leading the Imperial attack formation had lowered down to a course just above the black water surface. Between the ocean and the ship, Nilas could see a blue funnel that came from the belly of the Venator. Suddenly, the Star Destroyer pulled up and pulled a huge ball of water with it, barely smaller than the ship itself. It was being held and kept together by a tractor beam. Then it was launched directly at the city. Nilas hadn't seen this attack coming, just like the loss of gravity, and he cringed instinctively. "Hold on!" he shouted as the ball of water grew bigger fast behind the energy dome. Steam rose up, and a loud screech sounded when it broke through the shield at high speed. Nilas took all his power and surrounded himself with a reflecting layer of the Force, only a heartbeat before the ball of water collided with the city. He could feel how the wayless soldiers were being washed against walls, some even into the ocean. The water was getting through open doors and hangar decks and destroyed the engines of not submersible fighters. When it was over, Nilas loosened the Force protection, cursing. The clone soldier behind the light was gone, he hastily acknowledged. A big part of the hundreds of soldiers that had been able to cling onto something was now trapped in the wayless chaos above Tipoca City. Behind the shield, 50 Caminoan fighters and about 200 Imperial TIEs had begun a wild aerial battle. Those TIEs that were getting through the shield with decelerated engines were fiercely greeted by the city's air defense cannons. The battle had only just begun, but the Empire had already done significant damage. It's time, Nilas decided. Time to hit back and play our trump card. He reached out into the Force and ordered the mask to put the invisible hand in motion. Imperial Venator.
Sir, I came across something that I don't really understand.
The tactical officer looked up to Thrawn from the commando trench with a very confused look on his face. However, Nokas could not feel any fear coming from that young man. Obviously, Thrawn was different to most of the more aggressive captains that had increasingly been appointed during the last war year and that Nokas believed to be in leading positions of the Empire now. Thrawn had the officer project the anomaly on the holoscreen that was positioned between him and Nokas. The bluish stripy picture showed the gashed surface of the ocean. At about 100 meters, an increase of energy was shown, as well as a higher presence of matter.
It obviously is a ship.
The officer explained.
Almost underneath our current position. But I register only mass and movement and a few small energy sources, like the ones of big cannons. No engine signals.
Thrawn's face was free of emotion. Maybe it's been moved by a tractor beam, he suggested. They are copying our attack with the ball of water and use it on a ship that is difficult to detect without engines. Anyway, it is a trap we need to avoid. He turned around to the pilot section of the trench. Full thrust on the sublight drive. While Thrawn was still giving orders, Nokas followed the holographic projection and saw how the outlines of a shipwreck rose from the ocean and sent small stripes on their way up. 2 seconds later, the ship started to shake slightly from the impacts of enemy fire. One of the convoy ships was hit the hardest and immediately lost altitude. Damage reports from the small fleet started to come in, and Thrawn confirmed them with a nod and reacted with short instructions. Has the fire hit the smudger capsules in our bottom hull? Thrawn asked after a few moments.
Negative.
Nokas blinked confused over to Thrawn, who kept a straight face. What are smudger capsules? A technical innovation from Nokas' time in exile? Then suddenly, the sensor officer called out.
Captain? The hull model is identical with the invisible hand.
Thrawn's red glowing eyes stared at the holo image and seemed to not take notice of the Carmonian city islands anymore that were getting bigger behind the bridge window. A second shake went through the Venator when the invisible hand fired again. Meanwhile, the Star Destroyer was returning fire, but Nokas couldn't see on the hologram if it did any damage. Change of course, Thrawn declared. Bring us directly above the city's shield. The support ships are to keep the ghost ship busy for a while. When all commands had been given accordingly, Thrawn went past the hologram over to Nokas. Captain, what are smudger capsules? The Jedi asked hesitantly. I feel a few places of distorted force on the lower side of our hull. Is there a weapon system in use that can twist the force? Thrawn shook his head. Not exactly. For a moment he looked over to the bridge window, then he looked back at Nokas. Maybe you remember that we stopped for a few hours at an asteroid field not too far away. Nokas nodded. And now that he was talking about it, he realized that the sources of distorted force had not been there at the beginning of their voyage. Smudgers, Thrawn continued, is my crude term for a group of creatures that lives in that asteroid field. Not many know about them because no one ever flies into the field, but... Nokas smiled darkly. I know. The Force Shadow effect. Exactly, Thrawn confirmed. However, I managed to capture some of these smudgers and confine them into capsules. To do that, your presence was not only helpful, it was essential. You attracted them without knowing you would. The smudgers hunt Jedi? They react to force-sensitive beings, yes. They do that because they are too. Adding to Nokas' surprised expression, Thrawn said, These creatures are failed experiments from the Caminoans. They are the result of a failed attempt to create a Jedi. Nokas caught his breath. Thrawn's expression changed to slightly sympathetic. Your former master Raza Tabula belonged to the only two Jedi who know about the agreement with the Caminoans. And he didn't only visit the clones quite often, he also had himself becloned. Without success, as mentioned.
Sir, we are now directly above the city.
An officer reported, and Thrawn gave Nokas a nod when he left. Good, he said then. Open the capsules. Tipoca City, Camino. Nilas had recognized them instantly. The creatures from the asteroid field, the strange distortions in the Force, they were here. Directly above him, where the Imperial Star Destroyer was hovering over the city like a threatening shadow, he could clearly feel the presence. How was that possible? Had the Empire captured them? Nilas seriously doubted that creatures like that could be integrated into an organized strike force. They lived in space and... Now he understood. The Imperials had not only overclocked the repulsor to impede the rebels' movements, they had done it because the distorted creatures needed zero gravity to survive. And at the moment, there were no Imperials inside of the energy dome. The creatures could kill whenever they wanted. The capsules that Nilas could make out with some effort on the lower side of the Venator were opening now. Like skin-colored snowflakes, the creatures fell out and in the next moment passed through the energy dome. After that, their fall turned into a controlled movement. At the same time, the creatures emitted clouds in different colors. Nilas assumed that they communicated that way. Most of the clouds were red. Nilas pushed himself off the ground. The creatures weren't the only ones that could manage zero gravity. Admittedly, he was not as maneuverable as under normal circumstances, but the forces of the mask enabled him to effortlessly control his movements in the air. He drifted upwards. The platform was soon a dozen meters away. A few jetpack clones approached him, but he advised them to bring the other soldiers to safety instead of escorting him. Suddenly Nilas recognized that the city's stationary guns were constantly firing at a far higher frequency than before. And as he looked up again, he saw what was happening. All laser and rocket towers were concentrating their fire on the asteroid creatures. The highest point of the dome had already been badly weakened, because that's where all the shots struck that missed the creatures. Nilas cursed mentally. Now that he was hovering high above the city, he reached out to the Force, and he pulled a small group of the creatures towards him. He bundled his powers and let them burst a few meters above him. "Abandon concentrated fire immediately!" he shouted awkwardly and with Force-enhanced voice. He would take care of the creatures himself. He needed the artillery guns to fight off intruded TIE fighters. To his annoyance, the Caminoan officers that controlled the towers didn't seem to follow his order. They relentlessly continued their attack on the creatures, and between the light flashes and the laser clouds, Nilas could see how weakened the shield above him and the creatures already was. For a second he was almost paralyzed, then the engine noise of a TIE fighter woke him up again. Banter crap! The attacker had shot a few green energy bolts at him from close range. Nilas pulled out his lightsaber and deflected them in the last moment. The time to deflect them with the Force had been too short. Worried, he noticed that the sword beam had become a bit unstable. Even the legendary weapon of the Jedi were not designed to defend shots from large caliber weapons. The TIE had flown around Nilas and was about to fly its next attack. Nilas wouldn't let it come to that. Like he had done with Imperial fighters a few days ago, he felt out for the sensitive ion drive and detonated it. Blinking, he noticed that from the bright ball of fire a shadow was emerging. A pilot had jumped out of the dying fighter, without ejector seat but still at high speed. Quickly Nilas fended off one of the creatures that was approaching him from above. Then he took a second better look at the pilot of the TIE fighter. The man hovering in the air a few meters away from Nilas was dressed in a black armor. But the pilot's helmet had a different shape, and Nilas doubted that Imperial soldiers would wear a cape. Only when the stranger ignited a red lightsaber, Nilas understood. This man was no other than the Emperor's right hand, the Sith-Lord the better informed sources of Coruscant's underworld were quietly talking about. Nilas knew the name, but he hadn't seen an image yet. This was good. Vader was responsible for the death of countless Jedi. His wish to be able to avenge the Order was about to come true.
You have stolen something that belongs to me,
Vader said with the lightsaber still held up.
You will die fighting for the mask, just like your master.
You? Nilas said outraged. You killed him?
He was already dying.
Vader now began to approach Nilas.
But it fuels your anger. Yes, it was me. And now it is time that his Padawans and everyone who ever was important to him share his fate.
Fast as lightning, Vader shot towards Nilas, and a collision of the red and the blue blades started the battle. Imperial Venator. Sith, Nokas said quietly, and Thrawn turned around towards him. There are 2 Sith below us. Their energies have just been activated. It wasn't very easy for him to make out the 2 duelists in the ocean of smudgers, but their powers were immense, and so there was no doubt about their presence. Thrawn nodded slightly. Darth Vader is fighting a rogue Jedi, he explained emotionless. Vader did not come here with us, and is not under my command. The renegade has possibly played a part in Camino's rebellion, so his death would increase our chances for victory. Nokas didn't understand. Who is Darth Vader? Someone who must not find out that you are here, Thrawn relied. He's a Sith, and he's not on your side, but in a way he's on mine, if that makes you feel better. Not really. This thing is getting a bit too complicated to stay on top of it. If this Jedi had defected, why did Vader fight him then? And what former Jedi could radiate such dark powers as the Renegade did? The plan was in danger. Nokas was sure about that now. But if something went wrong, if one of the 2 mysterious fighters felt Nokas' presence, then the plan would fail, and he would probably never see Galve again. Something inside of his heart tightened. He had been gone for so long that in this galaxy he was nothing but a stranger anymore. In this battle, people were dying. That was all he understood. Oh yes, he understood. Since the Clone Wars, he knew death better than life. If the plan changed, Nokas had to be prepared. He had to figure out the mechanics of the battle, like he was able to back then. Captain, he said to Thrawn, why are the Caminoans bundling their gunfire on the smudgers? That weakens their shield. Also, weapons like that are too imprecise for such small creatures. That decision doesn't make any sense. Thrawn reacted with a barely recognizable headshake. It makes a lot of sense, he replied. The key to understanding a species is their art. The shape of what people create is the relationship that develops between the artist and his work. Both tell the attentive observer a lot about the elementary way of thinking he is dealing with. Nokas blinked. The Caminoans have decided on a strategically unwise concentrated fire. Because of their artistic understanding? Yes, exactly. The Caminoans' art is cloning. Every single copy is more than a product. It's a work of art. They always aim for perfection. The smudgers they created years ago are failures. They were barely able to survive and were deformed. If it wasn't for your master, they would have executed them immediately and atomized their remains. Instead, they were banished into the nearest asteroid field. But now, Nokas continued the sentence,
Now the Caminoans have the chance to destroy all evidence of their failure. This knowledge almost numbed him. The artists can finally demolish their failed work, and they'd do anything to achieve that. Thrawn turned away from Nokas again, and he said to one of the officers, "Wait until the shield directly beneath us is weak enough. Then you fire." Tipoca City, Camino. Nilas jumped through the weightlessness, the sword raced for the lethal strike. The two blades crashed together, followed by a loud screech. He knew that the Caminoans needed his support fighting against the creatures, and that he couldn't afford to spend too much time with Vader. Therefore, he put everything he had into his attack right away, unleashed a barrage of fast sword thrusts onto his opponent. Vader slowly and steadily stepped back, kept Nilas at bay with minimal movement. At first, Nilas had been annoyed by this, but then he realized that the reason for Vader's moves was that the armor restricted the Sith. Vader carried out a force strike and pushed the surprised Nilas a few meters back. Then the Sith used the gained time to throw a helpless clone soldier at him. But Nilas cut through the human projectile without hesitation and then slang the burned out wreck of a TIE fighter at Vader. The Sith deflected with his free hand and only just avoided a collision. "The Mask of Nihilus gives you powers," Nilas heard his opponent say. "But they are not your own powers. You barely know them." Nilas threw himself forward and shot towards Vader at the speed of a turbolift. "You will see, I am full of surprises!" He shouted, and with the last word he executed his strike. The battle flared up again, half a kilometer above the lights of Tipoca City, surrounded by soldiers, debris and swirling balls of ocean water. In the process, Nilas pulled more and more powers from the mask because he had to stabilize himself with the Force the whole time if he wanted to avoid being pushed away in the weightlessness by one of Vader's harder strikes. "I'm running out of time," Nilas thought grimly after he had gained time to catch breath. "If I wouldn't have to use so much of my concentration to control the invisible hand, Vader's head would be among those corpses floating around here already." He needed more. And death, that was lying inside the mask, was again mercifully willing to grant his wish. Nilas didn't recognize that by now not only the powers but also the decisions weren't his own anymore, not even when death dared another masterpiece. While it was controlling Nilas' body, effortlessly parried all of Vader's attacks, death paid its full attention to the Venator ship now that was dueling the invisible hand outside of the shield. Through Nilas, through the servant, the puppet, the connection to this world, Darth Nihilus reached for the Star Destroyer and pulled it towards the city. On board the Venator, Nokas was the first to feel the danger. 2 heartbeats later, Captain Thrawn reacted too. A push had gone through the ship, and while Thrawn could probably only make out the visible change, for example the fact that sparks were shooting from the consoles or that the plates were bending, Nokas could see the sheer magnitude of the danger. What had caught them was not a tractor beam, it was the will of a Sith-Lord. And Nokas had never felt such intense darkness before. "If we collide with the city while the shield is still active, we will shatter!" Thrawn shouted over to the bridge crew and hastily began to give orders in a spate of technical jargon. Nokas thought that the Imperials wanted to reconfigure certain sections of the engine, but he didn't know too much about these things. What he understood was that Thrawn seemed to have underestimated the rogue Jedi, and that was bad. Galve's life depended on Thrawn not being mistaken. In the moment that Thrawn decided to hang on to the safety handle in the commando corridor, far away in the center of Tipoca City, a steel door became victim of a detonator pack. Boba Fett stormed through it and disabled the surveillance camera with one shot. Tio Man followed with his soldiers while Langkawi's troops stayed back a bit. Since they had overclocked their repulsor, the rebels knew that they were here, and no one had a doubt that jetpack troops were already on their way. Disabling the gravity had given the troops time, but by now the Caminoans must have recovered.
The shield generator hangar's at the end of this corridor!
Fett shouted, and Tio Man gave the sign to proceed. The soldiers passed an open security gate, where Cowie and his troop again stayed behind to secure the escape route. Tio Man, on the other hand, continued his way to the generator. At Fett's nod, he shot the door console to pieces, and before the door had fully sunk into the floor, the first laser shots were firing towards him. In the same second, a kilometer closer to the dark storm clouds, Darth Vader understood what Nilas was doing. At first he had assumed that the now motionlessly floating ex-Jedi was collecting his powers, but then he recognized that Thrawn's Star Destroyer had sunk down to the city. The top of the ship pointed away from the city, towards the airspace where Caminoan fighter squadrons were battling Imperial fighters. But the Venator's jet engines were barely 100 meters away from the city's shield dome, and the distance was getting smaller and smaller. In his mind, Vader cursed. Then he used the Force to take one of the dead animals Thrawn had used and threw it towards Nilas. An arm's length before it reached its target, the smudger burned up. Ashes rained down onto Nilas' pale skin and sprinkled it with dark spots. When Vader realized that his opponent's power seemed to increase, he started to move himself again, the lightsaber ready to strike. At the same time, the Venator's engines overloaded and sped out an ocean of blue flames one last time. On the bridge, Nokas Mepur let himself fall and used the Force to weld himself to the floor. Thrawn shouted something. In the shield generator room, Boba Fett ducked from a laser blast that instead hit the tip of his jetpack. He ripped it off himself and quickly threw it towards the generators. Darth Vader's lightsaber pierced through Nilas' stomach. Intestines burned, but the face behind the white mask stayed stiff. Tio Man shot a rebelling clone soldier, then took cover. The jetpack floated through the weightlessness directly towards the shield generator's plasma wirings. The Venator's drive conked out in a final blue inferno. The flames poured over parts of the shield dome, then they extinguished. The jetpack exploded. Vader pulled his saber back out of Nilas. Thrawn closed his eyes. Nokas screamed for Galve. Boba Fett pushed a soldier aside, just away from the generator. He ran. Chain reaction. A unit caught fire, then the next. Tio Man was somewhere in the fire. The shield dome died off. Darth Nilas pulled the Star Destroyer for a last time, one last powerful pull. And through the deactivated shield, the ship stabbed backwards into the giant structures of Tipoca City. Langkawi thought the end of the universe had arrived. An immense quake had pushed him off his feet, and the aftershocks at first made it impossible for him to get up again. The gravity had returned. That was his only thought. Something had hit the city and had destroyed the repulsor. The quakes became weaker. A soldier from his troop, Sam, helped him up again, just in time to witness the arrival of the next disaster. Tio Man and Boba Fett stormed towards them. The two were about 24 meters away from the security door, and behind them, something half liquid, half gaseous was flowing into the generator room. Cowie had grown stiff. Beside him, he heard Sam murmur something that sounded like a bad feeling about the... Then finally, he contained himself. He turned his eyes away from Tio Man and the bounty hunter while both desperately ran for their lives and took a look at the helpless rest of his unit. Go, go, go! He shouted and wildly gesticulated with his blaster gun. Get out of here right now! Then he rushed towards the security gate. Where was the damn control panel? When Fett and Tio Man came through here, he would have to close the gate immediately or they would all burn in the fire. He couldn't find it. The door controls were... No! Langkawi looked up. The two had stopped, and Tio Man pressed one of the panel's buttons that was beside them at the wall of the corridor. The gate reacted. The flames had almost reached Fett and Tio Man. Cowie screamed, "No!"
The gate closed, then came the smoke, and finally a few seconds later the fire, and Kawi couldn't see anything anymore. When it finally was over, Nokas could barely believe it. It was dark on the Star Destroyer's bridge, now that the rain of sparks from the consoles had ended and all the lights were burned out. There were dead bodies in both officer trenches. In most cases, a power overload had killed the officer sitting directly in front of the console. Thrawn was lying on the floor. His lip was bleeding and his right leg looked bizarrely twisted. A loud squeak pulled Nokas out of the role of the silent observer. He rushed along the commando aisle to the motionless Thrawn, not knowing what he was supposed to feel. Thrawn had destroyed the city where Nokas had spent so many years, but Thrawn had also promised him that he would see his son again. And he had said even more, back in that cell on Righty Adamant, because... A second squeak, far below them, and this time terribly loud. "What was that?" he said while bending down towards Thrawn. He had decided to not feel anything anymore. The injured captain grimly smiled at him. "That was one of the pillars of Tipoca City." Thrawn coughed, and blood in the color of his eyes sprinkled onto his grey uniform. "It's collapsing." Nokas gasped. "What? But the way of the Star Destroyer, is it that? We are too heavy and now the entire city platform is sinking into..." He didn't dare to finish the sentence. Powerless, Thrawn shook his head. "It's more than that. The city islands of Tipoca City are too heavy for the pillars to carry them. They always were. It's only working with the help of the repulsor generator." Only now Nokas understood. The one that was overloaded by the mission unit, and when we rammed the city, we destroyed it. A third squeak, and Nokas thought he could feel how the ship's bridge was more and more tipping over. "Maybe," Thrawn said quietly, "we didn't hit it during our entry. Not with our hull, but we overloaded it completely." He let Nokas help him sit up in an upright position. "The repulsor works against matter of all kinds. In the moment that the Star Destroyer came into its reach, it tried to lift the enormous mass of the ship as well, and..." Thrawn stopped and made a declining gesture. "Why am I telling you this? It's not important anymore." From one of the bridge's trenches, a man in a burned uniform climbed up now.
"Captain,"
said the officer, and saluted with a movement that obviously caused him unexpected pain.
Most of the ship's systems are dead. The engines are burned out and the shields overloaded at impact.
Thrawn nodded. "Weapons? Tractor beam?"
Mostly functioning, sir, but that won't be enough to...
"Believe me, if we survive the next minute, I can promise you a few things." And with a deafening, cracking noise, one of the giant pillars collapsed. The light that pulled Tio Man back from the other world grew a lot more glaring and painful when he opened his eyes. Defying the pain in his bones, he turned away and rolled onto his side, biting his teeth. "Well, that was something." He grunted and sat up slowly, the shine of Fett's blaster lamp on his back. It was dark all around them. "Are you okay?" Fett made a confirming noise.
Yeah, a few burned armor plates. Had I reattached the cover only half a second later, the fire of the explosion would have killed us.
Tio Man nodded and forced himself up. Nothing seemed to be broken. "How did you know about the ventilation shaft?"
Just like you, I grew up here.
Tio Man could hear that while he was talking, Fett put a second energy capsule into his blaster.
And if my father got his will, then my playgrounds couldn't be dangerous enough. However, I only know this shaft from the construction plans.
Tio Man searched his belt bag for the lamp attachment for his own gun. He counted himself lucky not to have lost it during their wild fall through the spiral air shaft. We have construction plans on Camino? Tio Man asked and finally found the attachment. I was second in command on this mission. Why did I not know about that? He thought he heard the armor creak when Fett shook his head.
I had some when I was a child. A gift from a Mandalorian named Senal. But obviously they were fake. We are not where I thought we would be.
Tio Man nodded and switched on his own lamp. Okay, he first meant to say, but then he became aware of the importance of Fett's words. Hold on. He turned around. Are you telling me that our escape shaft has brought us to a place that the Kaminoans tried to hide? Fett nodded silently. Then he pointed the light beam at one of the walls, and Tio Man was staggered. Clone tanks. Empty clone tanks, exactly those in which Tio Man's life had begun as well. The light was reflecting in the transparent glassy covers, and blue hulls gave off an eerie shimmer wherever one of the two light beams grazed them. Every tank had a code printed on that always started with T10. There had to be about 200 of these tanks in this hall, not even close to the number found in the main halls. For energy supply reasons, such a small storage hall made absolutely no sense unless you were creating something here that you want to hide.
I already had a closer look at them before you regained consciousness. At first I thought this is where those creatures are from that Thrawn collected in the asteroid fields.
He paused for a moment.
But you know the Kaminoans. They are perfectionists, very precise. These tanks are designed for humans of exactly 1.83 meters height.
Tio Man swallowed.
Clones of my father.
Fett said out loud what both knew. In the distance, far below them, they heard a creak. Fett cursed quietly.
We're running out of time. Now that the repulsor is dead, the city weighs a lot more than the pillars can carry.
We have to get out of here. Tio Man agreed hastily. Fett had already pointed out at the beginning of their mission what would happen if the repulsor would collapse, and now the worst case scenario was here. A second creak just after Tio Man and Fett had started to move. They started to run, along a wall of tanks and towards the big exit door. But when they reached the door, a violet lamp at the nearby apparatus flashed up and seemed to shine through Tio Man's visor directly into his eyes. At first he thought they had activated a trap, but then nothing happened.
Whatever that was, we have to go.
In this moment, a hologram of an old man appeared directly in front of them.
Your DNS code indicates that you are a clone of the T10 series. I am Jedi Master Asa Tabula, and if you will, I am your spiritual father.
Tio Man's world froze, and the Jedi Master's hologram continued.
You may want to find out why you're different from the others. Not biologically, no. But there is something in your thoughts that differentiates the T10 series from the other clones. Something I whispered to you while you were barely more than embryos. It's deep inside of you.
Fett and Camino had moved into a far distance. T10, Tio, Order 66, Nokas. I did not obey because A third time the noise came from the deep, louder and worse than before. A burst. One of the pillars was collapsing. Tio Man felt how Fett grabbed him. His scream got lost in the noise of the catastrophe. The fall had almost been his end. Darth Vader was lying on the hull of the Venator Star Destroyer that had drilled into one of the city islands only seconds ago. He had fallen far after he had pulled his sword back out of Nilas, because only moments later the gravity had returned. Vader and the lifeless Nilas had been part of the hail of debris, balls of water, and clone soldiers that had gone down over Tipoca City. And Vader had saved them both. He had managed to slow down both their falls and take the deadliness out of the impact on the Venator's hull. Maybe he should have let Nilas die. But during their fight, he had realized something. The body of the ex-Jedi seemed to be suitable to be possessed by the spirit of the mask. Darth Nilas could use Nilas. And if Vader wanted to use Nilas to finally break the chains that the Emperor had put on him, then Vader needed Nilas alive, as much as he disliked sparing the life of Raza Tabula's Padawan. Vader had just begun to think about how he could leave Camino now, but he heard a loud noise from the deep. It sounded as if one of the pillars was under immense pressure. And if Vader considered that the city's weight was just increased by a full Star Destroyer, it was something he should have expected. Bunta crab. Hastily, Vader looked over to Nilas, who was still unconscious. Just like the mask, Nilas too functioned as a tunnel through which the Sith-Lord could reach this world. And when Darth Nilas had rammed the Star Destroyer into the city, the Sith-Lord's power had obviously become too great. If Vader wanted to use Nilas to kill the Emperor, he would have to solve this problem. But that had to wait. At the same time as the second creak of the pillar, Vader felt a wave of fear coming from inside the Venator. The ship almost stunk of it, despite the presence of the so highly praised Thrawn. And one of the creatures left exactly that kind of trace in the wave that Vader had learned to detect in the last 9 years. Down there was a Jedi. Vader started to move and jumped over to Nilas. He pulled the lifeless renegade into the air, not daring to take off the mask. Vader once had tried to touch the Sith Lord's mask in the Force, and it had almost been his end. For a moment, Vader cursed the fact that during the fall he had lost his lightsaber, and right after that he cursed himself a second time because he suddenly had to think about Obw-Wan. But then he regained control of his thoughts again. With a wink of his left hand, he burst the thin glass of a ceiling window. With his right hand, he let Nilas glide through it. Then he himself followed, and in the moment the door of the room closed behind them, and they stepped into the dark hallway, the city island tilted. Nokas knew that Vader had detected him, but at the moment the Sith wasn't even the biggest threat. One of the outer pillars had collapsed, and the surrounding pillars were also bending. Within seconds, the city island had gotten into a frightening oblique position. Just like a few minutes ago, when the Star Destroyer had stabbed into the city, the deafening noise of scraping metal layers was heard when the ship slid out of it again. Behind the suited panorama window of the half-destroyed bridge, the horizon moved upwards and made space for the giant wave mountains of the storm. Nokas held on to Thrawn when they plunged towards the window. Some debris that had loosened from the ceiling slid across the floor and piled up at the window. Panicking shouts confirmed that chaos had broken out in the officers' trench as well. Now suddenly the ocean was visibly getting closer, slow at first, but then faster and faster. The noise the Star Destroyer caused by leaving the city had become so loud that Nokas now used the Force to protect his hearing. Then suddenly they were in a freefall. Thrawn's red eyes were wide open, his teeth clenched together. Nokas only perceived the world around him as a brawl, a great tunnel with a dark blue end. Then the Venator broke through the water surface, and the world turned into a deep night. Their time was running out. With Nilas on his back, Vader was fighting his way through the corridors of the sinking Star Destroyer. The crew members, some just scared, others badly injured, barely noticed him in all the chaos and all their desperation. Alarm sirens were sounding, and a computer voice whose quality was getting worse fast warned about the intrusion of foreign objects into the ship. The words, "We are sinking," didn't seem to be part of the programming. In the Force, Vader could feel how the water took over more and more parts of the Star Destroyer. The ship had already suffered countless hull breaches during the battle against the Darth Nihilas controlled Invisible Hand, and the collision with the city had worsened its condition. Apart from the water, there was a second problem. The ship was turning. After the Venator had plunged into the ocean headfirst, it had slowly gotten back into a horizontal position. But because the commando tower was heavier, it tilted over to the deep and turned the bottom towards the receding surface. As a result of this, Vader and the surviving crew members who he either ignored or crushed to death, were walking across the hallway ceiling for the last 2 minutes. He used his last power reserves to burst open and jump through the floors above him, because the escape capsules, which were his last hope, were in the bottom of the ship, and that was now above him. The crew members had either forgotten that in their fear, or they were hoping to still find working fighters in the Star Destroyer's giant hangar. Vader couldn't be sure about this, but as far as he knew, the mass-produced and not very resilient Imperial starfighters, there would hardly be a functioning one left after the collision. Vader burst through another floor and found himself on the lowest deck of the ship in a low-ceilinged hall from where several escape capsules could be reached. Red lights indicated that some capsules were already missing. Thrawn had probably used the anchoring elements for the smudgers, but there was still enough left, and... A dozen meters away, directly beside the entrance to an escape capsule, Vader suddenly saw a Jedi. The man had dark hair and vigilant eyes that created a calm spot in his face that was marked by haste and fear. He was wearing plain grey clothing, as it was common for prisoners of the Empire, and he seemed to be unarmed, just like Vader. The Jedi looked at the Sith, but said nothing.
Have you killed Thrawn?
Vader asked.
No,
the Jedi answered straight-faced.
and if we fight, we both die.
Vader knew that the Jedi was right. A fight would take more time than they had left, and so the Jedi and the Sith turned their back on each other and boarded opposite escape capsules. The start mechanisms were activated simultaneously, and with a bang and in different angles the two capsules shot towards the surface. Below them, the Venator faded away in the deep. Thrawn managed to reach the officer's trench, almost falling over at the end. Several crew members were lying on the floor, bathed in blood. Some of them were receiving medical help. The bridge crew was the most disciplined crew on the ship, and so none of them had left their post to start the dangerous search for escape capsules, space fighters, or shuttles.
Sir?
Thrawn heard the voice of an officer sound from somewhere. Suddenly he realized that the man was standing right beside him.
The main engine is still dead, and we were not yet able to repair auxiliary drive.
I know, Thrawn replied and moved himself over to the console from where the giant hangar gates could be opened. The fact that this had not been done yet could only mean that no crew member in the hangar had found a functioning fighter and requested an exit. Thrawn activated the mechanism and was pleased to notice that it was working. They were now in the lower part, and the danger that potentially remaining air would escape was low. "Go over to the tractor beam controls," he ordered the officer beside him, but the man that until now had been so cool-headed suddenly was almost numbed. "Lieutenant!" Thrawn was about to shout out when the man punched him right in the face. Thrawn stumbled and crashed hard into one of the walls of the trench. He hit a console and accidentally rammed his elbow into a display, which probably had already been damaged though. Before Thrawn could say something or even defend himself against the obviously insane man, he received a kick in the stomach. Then the man opened a hatch under the commando corridor and pushed Thrawn inside, putting the white helmet of a stormtrooper on his head in the last moment. Now 3 things happened at the same time. The panorama screen of the bridge burst and water started to stream in. The hatch cover closed again. The man saluted. In his mind's eye, Thrawn could see what was happening on the bridge, but he couldn't really bear to see. It didn't just fill up with water, but was hit by several fists of waves that crashed into the walls and either crushed a few survivors or pulled them from the bridge out into the darkness. Thrawn didn't know how long the dying lasted. He couldn't do anything but wait. Then finally, he pulled the helmet the officer had put on his head to his shoulders and activated the seal that would make sure that no water could enter the helmet. After that, he counted to 3 in Cheong, the language of his people, and opened the hatch a bit. Water poured in and soaked Thrawn's uniform. At least, he thought, no energy was led into the water anywhere. The damaged consoles had probably all short-circuited. When the water level had reached his forehead, he fully opened the hatch. The officer's trench and the rest of the bridge were now just a part of the icy black ocean. Barely anything still indicated that all this once was an Imperial Star Destroyer. Along the trench and up to the console from where the tractor beam emitter of the ship could be controlled. Swimming was painful and cost him a lot of time. His right leg was obviously injured. When he reached the console, he held onto it. He was lucky. It was still working. Tipoca City was supplied with energy from facilities on the bottom of the ocean. This energy was turned into a gaseous state for its transport because this gas was a lot lighter than air. The Caminoans therefore only needed to pump it into the pillars. It would rise up to the city and to the surface by itself. Thrawn would make use of this for himself now. Before the bridge had been flooded, he had managed to open the hangar gates. A quick look on one of the few remaining displays showed that the hangar was still pointing down. Thrawn pointed several tractor beams at the pillar, aiming at places where the city's weight had caused cracks and leaks. The actual breaking point that was causing the central city island's oblique position was too far above for him to tap it. But this here would do the trick. The tractor beam pulled the gas from the pillar and transported it directly into the Venator's giant hangar that was a lot bigger than the ones in any other class of Star Destroyers. And after a while, Thrawn acknowledged with a smile that his plan was working out. The gas was light enough and could sufficiently be collected in the hangar. They slowly started to float upwards again. After the hours of collisions, the paths and laces of destiny divided again to escape on separate ways into the depths of space. The bounty hunter Boba Fett had gotten what he wanted, his freedom. He had helped Thrawn to defeat the rebelling Caminoans and clone troops, and the Imperial would not pursue him any longer. Maybe it was his satisfaction about the outcome of the day. Maybe it was a sentimental vein he had hoped to be dead that made him take a living passenger on board the Slave One for the first time. The T-10 clone called Tio Man. Tio Man had deserted, and Fett was not sure what reasons had made him make that decision. Possibly it was because of what Rana Tabula's hologram had said, or Tio Man was just not able to bear having had to shoot at other clones during the battle. Fett didn't know, but as he was able to telecontrol the Slave One, he had managed to bring Tio Man out of the destroyed city unnoticed. However, he would not make any detours for the clone. There were a few good things he had to explain to Jabba if Fett wanted to continue working for the Hutt. The next stop would be Tatooine. In a different part of the universe, a Sith and his living weapon were disturbing the silence of an old spaceship graveyard. Aboard one of the better preserved shipwrecks, former Jedi Padawan Nilas Dihr to regain consciousness. He couldn't feel the snow-white mask anywhere. And the silhouette of a deep black Sith-Lord was towering in front of him. "The mask," Vader said. "You will see it again sooner than you want. The darkness of Coruscant's Undercity is nothing compared to what is ahead of you." But Nilas barely listened. The last thing he remembered was Vader stabbing his lightsaber through him over Tipoca City. Countless organs had been destroyed. Not even a Bacta tank would have been able to save him. Why? Why was he still alive? In the Force, he felt deep dark amusement coming from Vader. "Exactly that," Vader said and pulled Nilas up into the air, "is the correct question." Nokas Mepur was speeding through hyperspace in a stolen Imperial shuttle. He had survived the Battle of Camino and had gotten through an encounter with Darth Vader unharmed. He really should feel like someone at the end of a successful adventure. But an adventure had more light than darkness, and this here was certainly not the end. While Nokas was putting the coordinates into the hyperspace computer, he relived all his conversations with Thrawn a second time in his thoughts. He remembered what Thrawn had said about the Force shadows, as well as the last words of the captain when Nokas had left the bridge of the sinking ship. He didn't know how much of all this was just a lie. But the information he had gotten from Thrawn was his best chance if he wanted to save his son. And if he didn't succeed, if Galve would die or was already dead, then all this wasn't even the start of an end, but the beginning of something that would cause many Imperials and other criminals a lot of pain. Bib Dorker stepped into the darkness of Jabba the Hutt's throne hall. The massive Hutt crime lord looked over the Twi'lek with his milky eyes. It was the first time that Durka was in Jabba's secret base, and surely the Hutt was asking himself if anyone could have followed him. But that wasn't possible, because Durka had changed ships on the way and had done everything possible to wipe his tracks. Durka bowed.
I have to report, noble Jabba, that the deal with Captain Thrawn has failed.
He now bowed even lower.
The captain has not given me the data that we were to receive for the position of the Jedi.
Durka straightened up again and swallowed. Jabba would be furious and kill him. But after all that had happened, Durka had decided that his death would only be fair. Too many had suffered because of him. It would be most fair if Nokas Mepur or someone from Selene was allowed to pull the trigger. But that wasn't possible anymore, and so it should happen here and by Jabba's hand now. Durka would die. He could have bought his life. He could have handed over the Jedi boy, the son of Nokas Mepur, to Jabba. That was what he had planned at first, but then he had brought the boy to safety.
And do you know why I did that?
The Hutt had a protocol droid hand him a blaster.
Because it's a difference if you breathe in the dark or if you breathe the dark.
Jabba raised the blaster. He fired, and Durka shone in blazing light. End of part 2. This audiobook was read by Oliver Rahn and Oliver Weiser. Based on a fanfiction novel by Tim Schmiele, a Banter Poodle production.